The kingdom that Æthelred I inherited in 865 represented the culmination of 3 centuries of West Saxon expansion and consolidation, its foundations laid by legendary figures whose achievements had transformed a small tribal settlement into the dominant Anglo-Saxon realm south of the Thames. The genealogical tradition that connected Æthelred to Cerdic, the semi-mythical founder of Wessex, who allegedly landed on the Hampshire coast in 495, provided more than a mere legitimacy. It established a continuous narrative of territorial conquest and political adaptation that would prove crucial during the Viking crisis of the 9th century. Cerdic's descendants had methodically expanded their territory through a combination of military prowess and strategic alliance building, gradually absorbing British kingdoms and establishing the administrative framework that would sustain West Saxon power for generations. The conquest of the Isle of Wight in 530, the subjugation of the South Saxons, and the eventual absorption of substantial portions of British territory created a kingdom that stretched from the English Channel to the Thames Valley, encompassing diverse populations and established trade networks that generated the wealth necessary for sustained military campaigns. The transformation of Wessex from a collection of tribal territories into a sophisticated kingdom reached its apex under Egbert, Æthelred's grandfather, whose reign from 802 to 839 established the political foundations that his descendants would inherit. Egbert's victory at Ellendun in 825 against Bjornwulf of Mercia marked the decisive shift in Anglo-Saxon political balance, ending 2 centuries of Mercian supremacy and establishing Wessex as the preeminent kingdom south of the Humber. This triumph enabled Egbert to extend West Saxon influence over Kent, Sussex, Surrey, and Essex, creating a territorial confederation that provided the resources and strategic depth necessary for the challenges that would emerge during his grandson's reign. The administrative innovations that Egbert implemented during his conquest of these territories established precedents that would profoundly influence Æthelred's approach to governance. The integration of existing local administrative structures with West Saxon practices created a hybrid system that balanced central authority with regional autonomy, allowing conquered territories to maintain their distinctive customs while ensuring their military and financial contributions to the kingdom's defence. This flexible approach to governance proved particularly valuable when dealing with the diverse populations that comprise the expanded West Saxon realm, from the Romano-British communities of the Thames Valley to the Germanic settlers of the southeastern kingdoms. Æthelwulf's accession in 839 marked the beginning of a reign that would fundamentally reshape the institutional foundations of Wessex, implementing administrative and military reforms that provided his sons with the tools necessary to confront the escalating Viking threat. The ecclesiastical reforms that Æthelwulf initiated during the early years of his reign reflected both his personal piety and his recognition that the church represented a crucial source of administrative expertise and cultural continuity. The royal grants to religious foundations that characterized his reign served multiple purposes, creating a network of literate administrators while establishing spiritual insurance against the uncertainties of an increasingly dangerous world. The military innovations that Æthelwulf implemented during the 840s and 850s proved particularly significant for his son's subsequent campaigns against Viking armies. The reorganisation of the fyrd system, which had traditionally relied on local levies serving for limited periods, created a more professional military structure capable of sustained campaigns against mobile enemy forces. The establishment of fortified positions at strategic river crossings and coastal locations provided defensive anchors that could serve as bases for counter-offensives, while the development of a more sophisticated logistical system enabled West Saxon armies to maintain operations far from their traditional territories. The ecclesiastical dimension of Æthelwulf's reforms reflected the broader cultural transformation that was reshaping Anglo-Saxon England during the 9th century. the king's extensive correspondence with Frankish religious leaders, his generous donations to continental monasteries, and his pilgrimage to Rome in 855, 856 demonstrated the extent to which Wessex had become integrated into the broader European Christian community. This integration brought significant benefits, including access to advanced administrative techniques, military technologies, and educational resources that would prove invaluable during the crisis years that followed. The succession arrangements that governed the transition between Æthelwulf's sons reflected centuries of West Saxon practice, balancing the principle of royal blood with pragmatic considerations of military effectiveness and political stability. The tradition of lateral succession, which prioritized adult male relatives over direct descent, had evolved as a response to the constant warfare that characterized early Anglo-Saxon politics, ensuring that kingdoms would be governed by experienced warriors rather than potentially vulnerable minors. This system had served Wessex well during previous crises, providing continuity of leadership while preventing the succession disputes that had weakened other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The resolution of the conflict between Æthelwulf and his eldest son Æthelbald during the mid-850 year established important precedents for subsequent succession arrangements. Æthelbald's seizure of the western portions of Wessex during his father's Roman pilgrimage represented a serious challenge to royal authority, but the negotiated settlement that divided the kingdom between father and son demonstrated the flexibility that characterized West Saxon political culture. This arrangement, which granted Æthelbald control over the traditional heartland of Wessex, while leaving Æthelwulf with the recently conquered Eastern Territories, provided a model for the cooperative relationships that would characterize the reigns of Æthelred and his brothers. The cultural influences that shaped Æthelred's early education reflected the broader transformation of West Saxon court culture during the mid-9th century, the Carolingian Renaissance, which had revitalized learning and administrative practices throughout the Frankish Empire, exerted considerable influence on Anglo-Saxon intellectual life through the extensive networks of communication that connected English religious foundations with their continental counterparts. The manuscripts, educational materials, and administrative techniques that flowed along these networks provided Anglo-Saxon rulers with access to the most advanced governmental practices of their era. The court schools that developed during Æthelwulf's reign represented a significant departure from traditional Anglo-Saxon educational practices, incorporating continental pedagogical methods and curriculum designs that emphasize practical skills alongside traditional learning. The young princes who attended these institutions received instruction in Latin literacy, legal principles, military strategy, and diplomatic protocol, preparing them for the complex challenges of 9th century kingship. The emphasis on practical statecraft, rather than purely literary or theological education, reflected the recognition that effective governance required sophisticated administrative skills and broad cultural knowledge. The religious dimension of Æthelred's education proved particularly significant given the central role that Christianity played in legitimizing royal authority and maintaining social cohesion during periods of crisis. The theological training that he received provided him with the intellectual framework necessary to understand the religious dimensions of kingship, while his exposure to continental religious practices broadened his understanding of the Church's potential contributions to effective governance. The relationships that he established with leading ecclesiastical figures during his youth would prove invaluable during his subsequent reign, providing him with trusted advisors and administrative specialists. The military training that complemented Æthelred's formal education reflected the harsh realities of 9th century political life, where royal authority ultimately depended on the ability to lead successful military campaigns. The weapons training, tactical instruction, and strategic education that he received prepared him for the practical challenges of commanding armies in the field, while his participation in actual military operations during his brother's reigns provided him with direct experience of combat leadership. This combination of theoretical knowledge and practical experience would prove crucial during the intensive warfare that characterized his own reign. The administrative and military foundations that Æthelred inherited from his predecessors would face their most severe test as Scandinavian raiders transformed from seasonal opportunists into permanent occupiers with territorial ambitions. The evolution of Viking activity during the 850s and early 860s represented a fundamental shift in the nature of the threat facing Anglo-Saxon England, as scattered raiding parties coalesced into organised armies capable of sustained campaigns against established kingdoms. The seasonal pattern of Viking raids that had characterised the early 9th century, with attackers arriving in spring and departing before winter storms, made North Sea crossings treacherous, gave way to a more ominous development, the establishment of permanent winter camps on English soil. The first documented instance of Vikings overwintering in England occurred on the Isle of Thanet in 850. 851, when a Danish force chose to establish a fortified camp rather than return to Scandinavia with their accumulated plunder. This seemingly minor tactical adjustment carried profound strategic implications, as it demonstrated the raiders' growing confidence in their ability to maintain themselves on hostile territory, while simultaneously indicating their intention to treat England as a theatre for extended operations, rather than merely a source of quick wealth. The Thanet encampment provided a secure base from which Danish forces could launch attacks throughout the Thames estuary, while its island location offered natural defensive advantages that made it virtually impregnable to Anglo-Saxon counterattacks. The success of the Thanet experiment encouraged other Viking leaders to adopt similar strategies, leading to the establishment of winter camps at strategic locations throughout eastern England. These fortified positions, typically constructed on islands or peninsulas that offered natural defensive advantages, served multiple functions within the evolving Viking strategy. They provided secure bases for storing plunder and maintaining equipment, offered protected harbours for the longships that represented the Vikings' primary strategic advantage, and created staging areas from which coordinated attacks could be launched against multiple targets. The camps also served as recruitment centres, attracting additional warriors from Scandinavia who were drawn by reports of successful operations and abundant opportunities for enrichment. The transformation of Viking tactics during this period reflected broader changes in Scandinavian society that were driving increased numbers of warriors to seek opportunities overseas. Population pressure in Denmark and Norway, combined with political consolidation that reduced opportunities for advancement within traditional hierarchies, created a surplus of ambitious young men who possessed military skills but lacked access to land or positions of authority within their home communities. The success of early raiding expeditions demonstrated that England offered not merely temporary enrichment, but potentially permanent settlement opportunities for those willing to seize them through force of arms. The organisational sophistication that characterised Viking operations during the late 850s and early 860s represented a significant evolution from the relatively simple raiding parties that had terrorised coastal communities during previous decades. Archaeological evidence from winter camps reveals complex logistical arrangements, including specialised workshops for maintaining weapons and equipment, storage facilities for provisions and plunder, and defensive earthworks that incorporated advanced engineering techniques. The camps functioned as military bases comparable to Roman castra, with clearly defined areas for different activities and defensive systems designed to withstand prolonged sieges. The intelligence networks that Viking leaders developed during their extended presence in England provided them with detailed knowledge of Anglo-Saxon political structures, military capabilities, and economic resources. The information gathered through these networks enabled them to identify vulnerable targets, anticipate defensive responses, and exploit divisions between Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Vikings' understanding of local geography, gained through years of raiding operations, allowed them to move rapidly between targets while avoiding areas where strong resistance might be encountered. This intelligence advantage proved particularly valuable when planning large-scale operations that required coordination between multiple forces operating across extensive territories. The formation of what contemporary sources term the Great Heathen Army during the early 860s represented the culmination of these organisational developments, bringing together Viking forces from across Scandinavia under unified command for the conquest of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The army that landed in East Anglia during 865 differed fundamentally from previous raiding expeditions in its scale, organisation, and strategic objectives. Rather than seeking portable wealth that could be transported back to Scandinavia, the Great Heathen Army aimed to conquer territory for permanent settlement, establishing Scandinavian kingdoms that would provide their followers with land and political authority. Later medieval sources, particularly those compiled during the 12th and 13th centuries, associated the Great Heathen Army's formation with the legendary figure of Ragnar Lothbrok, claiming that the invasion represented a coordinated revenge expedition launched by Ragnar's sons following their father's execution by Æthelred of Northumbria. However, contemporary 9th century sources, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Frankish Annals, make no mention of Ragnar Lothbrok in connection with the Great Heathen Army's activities. The silence of contemporary sources regarding this supposedly crucial motivation suggests that the Ragnar connection represents later literary elaboration rather than historical fact, possibly reflecting the medieval tendency to organise complex historical events around heroic narratives that provided satisfying explanations for otherwise bewildering developments. The strategic objectives that actually motivated the Great Heathen Army's invasion can be reconstructed from their subsequent actions and the broader context of 9th century Scandinavian expansion. The army's systematic approach to conquering Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, beginning with the weakest targets and gradually working towards more formidable opponents, suggests careful planning based on detailed intelligence regarding each kingdom's military capabilities and political vulnerabilities. The Vikings' decision to establish permanent bases in conquered territories, rather than simply extracting tribute and departing, indicates their intention to create lasting Scandinavian settlements that could serve as stepping stones for further expansion. The composition of the Great Heathen Army reflected the international character of 9th century Viking expansion, drawing warriors from Denmark, Norway and Swedish territories who are united by shared cultural traditions and common strategic objectives, rather than narrow dynastic loyalties. Archaeological evidence from Viking Age Scandinavia suggests that the army's leadership included members of established aristocratic families who possessed the resources necessary to organise and equip large military expeditions. These leaders brought with them not merely warriors but also the administrative expertise necessary to govern conquered territories and the diplomatic skills required to negotiate with both Anglo-Saxon opponents and potential Scandinavian allies. The military innovations that characterised the Great Heathen Army's operations demonstrated the Vikings' ability to adapt their traditional tactics to the requirements of territorial conquest. The longship technology that had enabled their initial raiding successes remained crucial for strategic mobility, allowing the army to move rapidly between theatres of operation and maintain communication with Scandinavian bases. However, the army also incorporated siege techniques and fortification methods that enabled them to capture and hold fortified positions, transforming them from raiders who avoided strong defences into conquerors capable of reducing the most formidable Anglo-Saxon strongholds. During these crucial years of Viking consolidation, Æthelred gained invaluable military experience serving in the armies of his brothers Æthelbald and Æthelbert, participating in the defensive campaigns that represented Wessex's initial response to the escalating Scandinavian threat. The battles fought during this period, provided him with direct experience of Viking tactical methods, revealing both the strengths and vulnerabilities of Scandinavian military organisation. His observation of enemy formations, weapon techniques, and battlefield behaviour gave him insights that would prove crucial during his subsequent reign, when he would face the full force of Viking expansion. The defensive strategies that Wessex developed during the reigns of Æthelred's brothers reflected careful analysis of Viking operational methods and represented significant innovations in Anglo-Saxon military practice. The traditional feared system, which had served adequately against other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and British opponents, required substantial modification to address the mobility and tactical flexibility that characterised Viking armies. The development of rapid response capabilities, including the maintenance of mounted forces that could match Viking mobility, represented a fundamental departure from traditional Anglo-Saxon military organisation. The alliance-building efforts that characterised West Saxon diplomacy during this period reflected recognition that no single Anglo-Saxon kingdom possessed the resources necessary to resist Viking expansion independently. Æthelred's participation in diplomatic missions to neighbouring kingdoms provided him with detailed knowledge of the political dynamics that shaped inter-kingdom relationships, while his involvement in military cooperation agreements gave him practical experience of the challenges involved in coordinating multi-kingdom defensive operations. These diplomatic skills would prove essential during his own reign, when the survival of Anglo-Saxon independence would depend on effective cooperation between previously competitive kingdoms. The intelligence networks that Wessex developed during the late 850s and early 860s provided crucial information regarding Viking movements and intentions, enabling Anglo-Saxon leaders to anticipate attacks and coordinate defensive responses. Æthelred's involvement in these intelligence operations gave him detailed knowledge of Viking organisational methods and strategic planning processes, insights that would prove invaluable when he assumed independent command. The spy networks, informant systems, and communication channels that he helped establish during his brother's reigns created the foundation for the sophisticated intelligence apparatus that would support his subsequent military campaigns. The fall of East Anglia to the Great Heathen Army during 865 demonstrated the effectiveness of Viking tactical innovations, while revealing the vulnerability of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that failed to adapt their defensive strategies to address the new threat. King Edmund's defeat and execution marked the end of East Anglian independence, transforming a formerly powerful kingdom into a Viking-controlled territory that would serve as a base for further expansion. The speed with which the Great Heathen Army overwhelmed East Anglian defences shocked contemporary observers and provided a stark warning of the fate that awaited other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that underestimated Viking capabilities. The strategic implications of East Anglia's conquest extended far beyond the immediate territorial loss, as Viking control of this kingdom provided the Great Heathen Army with access to the extensive river systems that connected eastern England with the interior regions where other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms maintained their power centres. The fenland waterways that had previously served as natural barriers protecting the heart of Anglo-Saxon England now became highways for Viking penetration, enabling rapid movement of forces and supplies between widely separated theatres of operation. The agricultural resources of East Anglia, combined with its established trade networks, provided the Vikings with the economic foundation necessary to sustain extended military campaigns. The collapse of Northumbrian resistance during 867 eliminated the last major Anglo-Saxon kingdom north of the Thames, leaving Wessex and Mercia as the only remaining independent English territories. The internal divisions that had weakened Northumbria during the preceding decades, particularly the rivalry between Ælla and Osbert, prevented effective coordination of defensive efforts and enabled the Vikings to exploit political divisions through diplomatic manipulation. The capture of York provided the great heathen army with a major urban centre that could serve as an administrative capital for their expanding territorial empire, while the destruction of Northumbrian military power removed the last significant obstacle to Viking expansion southward. The transformation of the political landscape that resulted from these Viking conquests created the strategic context that would define Æthelred's reign, as Wessex found itself confronting an enemy that controlled vast territories and commanded resources comparable to those of a major European power. The great heathen army's success in establishing permanent Scandinavian kingdoms in eastern and northern England demonstrated that the Viking threat had evolved beyond mere raiding into a systematic campaign of territorial conquest that threatened the very survival of Anglo-Saxon civilization. The military, diplomatic, and administrative challenges that this transformation created would test every aspect of the governmental system that Æthelred had inherited from his predecessors. The death of King Æthelbert in the autumn of 865 occurred during one of the most precarious moments in West Saxon history, as Viking forces consolidated their control over East Anglia while preparing for their next phase of territorial expansion. Contemporary sources provide limited details regarding the specific circumstances of Æthelbert's death, though the absence of any reference to battlefield casualties or violent causes suggests that natural illness rather than enemy action claimed the king's life. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's terse notation of his passing reflects the broader pattern of 9th century record-keeping, where chroniclers focus primarily on military events and political developments rather than personal details about royal deaths. The timing of Æthelbert's death created immediate challenges for the West Saxon succession, as the kingdom faced external threats that demanded experienced military leadership, while internal political dynamics required careful management to prevent factional disputes that could weaken royal authority. The established West Saxon succession practices that had governed previous transitions between brothers provided a framework for Æthelred's accession, but the extraordinary circumstances created by the Viking presence introduced complications that previous generations had never confronted. The principle of lateral succession, which prioritized adult male relatives over direct descendants, had evolved specifically to ensure that kingdoms would be governed by experienced warriors during periods of crisis, making Æthelred the natural choice despite any potential claims from Æthelbert's young sons. The succession process itself appears to have proceeded smoothly, suggesting that Æthelred had already established himself as his brother's designated heir and had gained acceptance from the key nobles whose support was essential for effective royal authority. The speed with which he assumed control of royal administration, military command and diplomatic relationships indicates that the transition had been planned in advance, possibly during Æthelbert's final illness, when the inevitability of succession became apparent. The absence of any recorded opposition to Æthelred's accession contrasts sharply with the succession disputes that had plagued other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms during similar periods of external pressure, demonstrating the institutional maturity that West Saxon political culture had achieved. The coronation ceremony that formally confirmed Æthelred's royal status took place at Winchester, the traditional centre of West Saxon power, where the symbolic elements of kingship were transferred from the deceased monarch to his successor. The royal regalia that Æthelred received during this ceremony included not merely ceremonial objects, but practical symbols of governmental authority, including the royal seal that validated official documents and the ceremonial weapons that represented his role as military commander. The ecclesiastical blessing that accompanied his coronation provided religious legitimacy for his rule, while creating formal obligations to protect Christian communities and support church institutions throughout his realm. The immediate challenges that confronted Æthelred upon his accession demanded swift action across multiple fronts, as the new king faced simultaneous pressures from external enemies, internal administrative requirements, and the need to establish his personal authority within existing governmental structures. the Viking threat represented the most pressing concern, as intelligence reports indicated that the Great Heathen Army was preparing to expand its operations beyond East Anglia into territories that directly threatened West Saxon security. The army's establishment of permanent bases in conquered territories demonstrated their intention to create lasting Scandinavian settlements rather than simply extracting tribute, fundamentally altering the strategic calculations that had guided previous Anglo-Saxon responses to Viking raids. The internal political dynamics that Æthelred inherited required equally urgent attention, as the nobility whose support was essential for effective governance needed reassurance regarding their positions within the new administration. The older men who governed individual shires possessed considerable autonomous authority and commanded local military forces that were crucial for national defence, making their loyalty essential for any coherent response to external threats. The Thanes, who formed the backbone of the royal military establishment, similarly required confirmation that their service would be appropriately rewarded and that their traditional privileges would be maintained under the new regime. Resource allocation for defence presented perhaps the most complex challenge facing the new king, as the traditional sources of royal revenue were insufficient to support the expanded military establishment that the Viking threat demanded. The tribute payments that had previously satisfied Viking raiders were no longer adequate to address armies that sought territorial conquest rather than portable wealth, while the costs of maintaining standing forces capable of rapid response to enemy movements far exceeded the resources that seasonal field service had traditionally required. The need to balance immediate military expenditures against long-term economic stability created difficult choices that would influence every aspect of royal policy throughout Æthelred's reign. The military appointments that Æthelred made during his first months as king reflected both his understanding of the strategic challenges facing Wessex and his need to establish personal authority over the existing command structure. The promotion of experienced warriors who had demonstrated their effectiveness during previous campaigns against Viking forces provided continuity of military leadership while ensuring that key positions were held by individuals whose loyalty to the new king was unquestioned. The appointment of his most trusted companions to crucial positions within the royal household created a core of reliable advisors who could provide counsel on both military and administrative matters. The selection of new aldermen for key frontier shires demonstrated Æthelred's recognition that effective defence required local commanders who possessed both military expertise and detailed knowledge of their territory's geography, resources, and population. The individuals chosen for these positions typically combined extensive battlefield experience with proven administrative capabilities, as the evolving nature of Viking warfare required commanders who could coordinate complex defensive operations while maintaining the civil governance that sustained their region's contributions to the kingdom's overall defence. The careful balance between military effectiveness and political reliability that characterised these appointments reflected Æthelred's understanding of the delicate relationship between central authority and local autonomy that sustained West Saxon governmental structures. The diplomatic overtures that Æthelred initiated with neighbouring kingdoms represented a significant departure from traditional West Saxon foreign policy, as the Viking threat created common interests that transcended the competitive relationships that had previously characterised inter-kingdom politics. The embassy sent to Burgred of Mercia during the winter of 865. 866 carried proposals for military cooperation that would have been inconceivable during previous decades, when Wessex and Mercia had competed for supremacy over the smaller kingdoms of southern England. The specific terms of the proposed alliance included provisions for mutual military assistance, coordinated intelligence sharing, and joint operations against Viking forces that threatened either kingdom's territory. The negotiations with Kentish leaders reflected Æthelred's understanding that effective defence of the Thames estuary required cooperation between West Saxon forces and the local militias that possessed intimate knowledge of the complex river systems and coastal geography that characterised this crucial region. The agreements reached with Kentish nobles provided for the integration of local forces into broader defensive plans while respecting the traditional autonomy that these communities had maintained despite their nominal subordination to West Saxon authority. The careful balance between central coordination and local independence that these arrangements established would prove crucial during the intensive military campaigns that followed. The establishment of Æthelred's royal household during his early months as king created the administrative infrastructure necessary to coordinate the complex governmental activities that the crisis demanded. The appointment of trusted individuals to key positions within the royal administration ensured that crucial functions would be performed by people whose loyalty was unquestioned, while the expansion of existing administrative structures provided the capacity necessary to handle the increased volume of military, diplomatic, and fiscal activities that the emergency required. The royal chancery that produced official documents and maintained governmental records was significantly expanded to handle the correspondence necessary for coordinating multi-kingdom defensive operations. The selection of key advisors who would influence Æthelred's decision-making throughout his reign reflected his understanding that effective kingship required access to expertise in multiple specialized areas, from military strategy and diplomatic protocol to fiscal administration and legal interpretation. The individuals chosen for these advisory roles typically combined extensive practical experience with demonstrated loyalty to the royal house, ensuring that their counsel would be both technically sound and politically reliable. The informal networks of communication and consultation that developed around these core advisors created the foundation for the collaborative approach to governance that would characterize Æthelred's administration. The military advisors who gained prominence during Æthelred's early reign included veterans of previous campaigns against Viking forces who possessed detailed knowledge of enemy tactical methods and strategic objectives. Their insights into Viking organizational structures, command relationships, and operational procedures provided crucial intelligence for planning defensive operations. While their battlefield experience enabled them to assess the effectiveness of proposed tactical innovations, the integration of these military specialists into the broader advisory structure ensured that strategic planning would be informed by practical understanding of combat realities rather than theoretical considerations alone. The ecclesiastical advisors who joined Æthelred's inner circle brought expertise in areas that extended far beyond purely religious matters, as church leaders possessed educational backgrounds, administrative experience, and international contacts that were invaluable for effective governance. The bishops and abbots who provided counsel to the new king had access to continental sources of information regarding Viking activities in Frankish territories, enabling them to provide strategic intelligence that complemented the tactical knowledge provided by military advisors. Their understanding of legal traditions, diplomatic protocols, and administrative procedures proved particularly valuable when negotiating agreements with neighbouring kingdoms and managing the complex logistics of multi-kingdom defensive operations. The fiscal advisors who helped Æthelred navigate the financial challenges created by the Viking crisis possessed specialised knowledge of royal revenues, taxation systems, and resource allocation that was essential for sustaining expanded military operations. Their expertise in managing the traditional sources of royal income, including land rents, judicial fines, and trading duties, enabled them to identify potential areas for increased revenue generation without creating undue hardship for the population whose support was essential for effective resistance. The innovative financing mechanisms that they developed during Æthelred's early reign provided the foundation for the sustained military efforts that would define his kingship. The intelligence network that Æthelred inherited from his predecessors required immediate expansion and reorganization to address the sophisticated information requirements that Viking territorial ambitions created. The traditional sources of information regarding enemy activities, which had relied primarily on reports from frontier communities and occasional diplomatic contacts, were inadequate for tracking the movements and intentions of organised armies operating across multiple kingdoms. The development of more systematic intelligence gathering procedures, including the recruitment of informants within Viking-controlled territories and the establishment of communication networks that could rapidly transmit crucial information across long distances, became a priority that demanded both financial resources and careful coordination with allied kingdoms. The legal framework that governed Æthelred's exercise of royal authority required careful consideration as the king balanced the need for decisive action against the traditional limitations that Anglo-Saxon custom placed on a monarchical power. The emergency conditions created by the Viking threat provided justification for extraordinary measures that might otherwise have exceeded accepted royal prerogatives, but the implementation of such measures required careful consultation with legal advisers who could ensure that necessary actions remained within acceptable bounds. The precedents established during these early months of crisis would influence the development of royal authority throughout Æthelred's reign and beyond, making it essential that they reflect both practical necessity and constitutional propriety. The strategic intelligence that reached Æthelred's court during the winter months of 865-866 painted an increasingly dire picture of Viking intentions, as reports from Mercian spies and Northumbrian refugees confirmed that the great heathen army was preparing for a massive northward expansion that would fundamentally alter the political geography of Anglo-Saxon England. The army's methodical consolidation of East Anglian territories had provided them with secure supply lines, established administrative centres, and most crucially, detailed intelligence regarding the internal divisions that plagued the kingdoms beyond their current borders. The systematic nature of their preparations, including the construction of additional fortified bases along river systems and the recruitment of additional warriors from Scandinavian territories, demonstrated that their next campaign would dwarf their previous operations in both scale and strategic sophistication. The target that emerged from these intelligence reports was Northumbria, where a devastating civil war between rival claimants to the throne had created precisely the conditions that Viking strategists sought to exploit. The conflict between Æthelred and Osbert had divided the kingdom's military resources, while destroying the political unity necessary for effective resistance to external invasion. Æthelred, who had seized power through a combination of military force and political manipulation, controlled the southern portions of the kingdom, including the crucial stronghold of York, while Osbert maintained his claim to legitimate succession through his connection to the traditional royal bloodline and commanded significant support among the northern nobility, who resented Ætheled's usurpation. The intelligence networks that Viking leaders had developed during their extended presence in England provided them with detailed information regarding both claimants' military capabilities, political vulnerabilities, and strategic priorities. Their agents, operating under various disguises throughout Northumbrian territory, had mapped the kingdom's defensive installations, identified key supply routes, and established contacts among disaffected nobles who might be persuaded to collaborate with invaders rather than support either rival king. The sophistication of this intelligence operation reflected the Vikings' evolution from opportunistic raiders into systematic conquerors who understood that successful territorial expansion required comprehensive knowledge of target territories' political, military, and economic structures. The great heathen army's movement northward during the spring of 866 represented a masterpiece of military logistics, as thousands of warriors, along with their equipment, supplies, and supporting personnel, advanced through territories that had never witnessed such a massive military migration. The army's route followed established river systems that provided both transportation advantages and strategic flexibility, enabling rapid movement while maintaining access to the naval forces that remained their ultimate guarantee of retreat if circumstances demanded withdrawal. The longships that accompanied the land-based forces served multiple functions, carrying essential supplies, providing reconnaissance capabilities, and maintaining communication with Scandinavian bases that could provide reinforcements if needed. Archaeological evidence from sites along the army's route of march reveals the sophisticated logistical arrangements that sustained this massive military operation, including temporary camps equipped with workshops for maintaining weapons and equipment, storage facilities for provisions, and defensive earthworks that could protect the army during rest periods. The camp's locations demonstrate careful advanced planning, as they were positioned to take advantage of natural defensive features while providing access to water sources and grazing areas for the horses that had become an increasingly important component of Viking military operations. The speed with which these installations could be constructed and dismantled reflected years of experience in mobile warfare across diverse European territories. The army's arrival at York during the autumn of 866 caught the city's defenders completely unprepared, as the ongoing civil war had prevented either Æthelred or Osbert from maintaining adequate garrison forces in the kingdom's most important urban centre. The city's Roman walls, which had provided effective protection against previous enemies, proved inadequate against attackers who possessed both the siege equipment necessary to breach fortified positions and the tactical knowledge required to exploit defensive weaknesses. The Vikings' understanding of urban warfare, gained through their campaigns in Frankish territories where they had captured numerous fortified cities, enabled them to adapt their assault techniques to York's specific defensive characteristics. The capture of York on November 1st, 866, marked a turning point in the Viking conquest of Anglo-Saxon England, as the fall of Northumbria's primary stronghold demonstrated the futility of resistance against the great heathen army's overwhelming military superiority. The city's strategic location at the confluence of the rivers Ouse and Foss provided the Vikings with control over the river systems that connected the North Sea with the interior regions of northern England, while its established administrative infrastructure offered ready-made governmental structures that could be adapted to serve Scandinavian territorial ambitions. The wealth accumulated within the city's churches, royal treasury and merchant establishments provided immediate rewards for the army's followers while generating resources for future military operations. The administrative arrangements that the Vikings implemented following their capture of York reflected their sophisticated understanding of the requirements for governing conquered territories, as they established hybrid governmental structures that combined Scandinavian leadership with existing Anglo-Saxon administrative practices. The appointment of Scandinavian jarls to key positions within the city's government provided political control while ensuring that crucial administrative functions continue to operate under experienced supervision. The retention of selected Anglo-Saxon officials who possessed essential technical knowledge enabled the new regime to maintain tax collection, judicial proceedings, and commercial activities that generated the revenues necessary to sustain military operations. The transformation of York into the administrative centre of Viking-controlled northern England required extensive modifications to the city's physical infrastructure, as the new rulers adapted existing buildings and constructed additional facilities to serve their governmental and military requirements. The royal palace complex was expanded to accommodate Scandinavian administrative personnel, while the city's defences were strengthened through the construction of additional earthworks and the installation of advanced siege equipment that could repel potential counterattacks. The harbour facilities along the River Ouse were enlarged to accommodate the longship fleets that maintained communication with other Viking-controlled territories and provided access to Scandinavian reinforcements. The news of York's fall reached Æthelred's court through a network of informants and refugees who had witnessed the city's capture, providing detailed accounts of Viking military capabilities and administrative innovations that would influence West Saxon defensive planning for years to come. The reports described not merely the tactical methods, that had enabled the Vikings to overcome the city's defences, but also the systematic approach that they employed to establish control over conquered populations. The combination of calculated brutality against resistance leaders and pragmatic cooperation with individuals willing to collaborate created a model for territorial governance that differed fundamentally from traditional Anglo-Saxon practices. The political ramifications of Northumbria's collapse extended far beyond the immediate territorial loss, as the elimination of the kingdom that had traditionally served as a buffer between Wessex and Scandinavian territories fundamentally altered the strategic balance of power throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The refugee populations that fled southward following York's fall brought with them not merely tales of Viking military prowess, but detailed intelligence regarding enemy organisational methods, strategic objectives, and administrative capabilities that provided crucial insights for defensive planning. The displaced nobles, clergy and merchants who sought sanctuary in West Saxon territories represented both a valuable source of information and a significant burden on resources that were already strained by military preparations. The ecclesiastical refugees who reached Wessex following Northumbria's conquest provided particularly valuable intelligence regarding Viking attitudes toward Christian institutions and religious practices, as their first-hand observations of Scandinavian administrative policies revealed a more complex relationship between conquerors and conquered than traditional sources suggested. While Viking forces had indeed destroyed several monasteries and executed clergy who resisted their authority, they had also demonstrated willingness to protect religious institutions that submitted to their rule and continue to provide essential services to local populations. This pragmatic approach to religious administration reflected the Vikings' recognition that successful territorial governance required the cooperation of established social institutions rather than their complete destruction. The military intelligence that Northumbrian refugees provided regarding Viking tactical innovations proved particularly valuable for Æthelred's strategic planning, as their detailed observations of enemy combat methods revealed both strengths and vulnerabilities that could be exploited in future engagements. The Vikings' increasing reliance on cavalry forces, their sophisticated siege techniques, and their ability to coordinate complex multi-unit operations demonstrated their evolution from traditional Scandinavian raiders into a professional military organisation comparable to the best continental armies. However, the refugees also reported weaknesses in Viking logistics, communication systems, and garrison arrangements that suggested potential opportunities for effective counterattacks. The economic intelligence gathered from Northumbrian merchants and administrators who had observed Viking fiscal policies provided crucial insights into the resource requirements that sustained enemy military operations, revealing both the sources of their strength and potential vulnerabilities that might be exploited through strategic economic warfare. The Vikings' systematic exploitation of conquered territories' agricultural production, their control over established trade networks, and their ability to extract tribute from subjugated populations generated revenues that far exceeded traditional Scandinavian resources. However, their dependence on continuous territorial expansion to satisfy their followers' expectations for enrichment created strategic pressures that might be turned to West Saxon advantage through careful diplomatic and military planning. The refugee crisis that resulted from Northumbria's collapse created immediate challenges for Æthelred's administration, as thousands of displaced persons required food, shelter and protection, while contributing little to the kingdom's defensive capabilities. The integration of these populations into West Saxon society demanded careful management to prevent social tensions while ensuring that their specialised knowledge and skills could be effectively utilised for the kingdom's benefit. The nobles among the refugees possessed military experience and political connections that could prove valuable for intelligence gathering and diplomatic initiatives, while skilled craftsmen and merchants brought technical knowledge that could enhance West Saxon economic and military capabilities. The strategic implications of losing Northumbria as a buffer kingdom forced Æthelred to fundamentally reconsider West Saxon defensive strategy, as the kingdom now faced direct exposure to Viking territorial ambitions without the protection that Northumbrian resistance had previously provided. The traditional defensive arrangements that had relied on advance warning from northern allies and the assumption that potential invaders would be weakened by fighting through intervening territories were no longer viable in the face of an enemy that controlled extensive territories and commanded resources comparable to those of major European powers. The development of new defensive concepts that could address this transformed strategic environment became an urgent priority that demanded both innovative thinking and substantial resource commitments. The diplomatic initiatives that Æthelred launched following York's fall reflected his recognition that West Saxon survival depended on building effective alliances with the remaining independent Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, particularly Mercia, which now shared Wessex's vulnerability to Viking expansion. The embassies sent to Bergred during the winter of 866. 867 carried proposals for comprehensive military cooperation that went far beyond traditional inter-kingdom agreements, including provisions for joint command structures, shared intelligence operations, and coordinated resource allocation that would enable effective resistance to Viking territorial ambitions. The negotiations required careful balancing of West Saxon strategic interests against Mercian concerns regarding sovereignty and autonomy, as both kingdoms recognised that cooperation was essential while remaining suspicious of each other's ultimate intentions. The intelligence-gathering operations that Æthelred expanded following Northumbria's conquest reflected the new king's understanding that effective resistance to Viking expansion required detailed knowledge of enemy capabilities, intentions, and vulnerabilities that could only be obtained through systematic espionage activities. The spy networks that had previously focused on gathering information about raiding activities were reorganised and expanded to address the intelligence requirements created by confronting a territorial empire rather than scattered raiding parties. The recruitment of agents capable of operating within Viking-controlled territories, the establishment of communication systems that could rapidly transmit crucial information across long distances, and the development of analytical capabilities that could interpret complex intelligence data became priorities that demanded both financial resources and specialised expertise. The defensive preparations that accelerated throughout West Saxon territories during the months following York's fall demonstrated Æthelred's commitment to creating multiple layers of resistance that could slow Viking advances while providing opportunities for effective counterattacks. The fortification of key river crossings, the establishment of supply depots at strategic locations, and the construction of beacon systems that could rapidly communicate enemy movements reflected lessons learned from observing Viking operational methods. The integration of these defensive installations into comprehensive strategic plans required coordination between local commanders and central authorities that tested the flexibility and effectiveness of West Saxon governmental structures. The intelligence reports that reached Æthelred's court during the spring of 867 carried increasingly urgent warnings that the great heathen army's consolidation of Northumbrian territories represented merely the first phase of a comprehensive campaign designed to subjugate all remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The systematic nature of Viking administrative arrangements in York, combined with their methodical recruitment of additional warriors from Scandinavian territories, demonstrated that their territorial ambitions extended far beyond the northern kingdom they had already conquered. The strategic positioning of Viking forces along the river systems that connected northern England with Mercian territories provided clear evidence of their intention to expand southward, while their diplomatic overtures to disaffected nobles throughout the Midlands revealed a sophisticated understanding of the political vulnerabilities that could be exploited to facilitate further conquest. King Bergred of Mercia found himself confronting a strategic nightmare that his predecessors could never have imagined, as the traditional buffer territories that had protected the Mercian heartland from northern threats had been systematically eliminated by Viking expansion. The collapse of Northumbrian resistance had exposed Mercia's northern frontiers to direct attack by forces that possessed both overwhelming military superiority and detailed intelligence regarding the kingdom's defensive capabilities. The internal political pressures that Burgred faced from nobles who questioned his ability to provide effective leadership during the crisis were compounded by economic strains created by the need to maintain expanded military forces while accommodating thousands of refugees from conquered territories. The embassy that arrived at Æthelred's court during the early summer of 867 carried Burgred's formal request for West Saxon military assistance, marking a dramatic departure from the competitive relationship that had traditionally characterized interactions between the two kingdoms. The Mercian envoys, led by experienced diplomats who possessed detailed knowledge of West Saxon political structures and strategic priorities, presented arguments that emphasized the common interest that both kingdoms shared in preventing further Viking expansion. Their proposals included specific provisions for joint military operations, coordinated intelligence gathering, and shared resource allocation that would enable effective resistance to Viking territorial ambitions, while respecting the sovereignty concerns that remained paramount for both rulers. The strategic calculations that influenced Æthelred's response to Mercian appeals reflected his sophisticated understanding of the transformed political landscape that Viking conquests had created throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The traditional West Saxon policy of allowing potential enemies to exhaust themselves through conflicts with intervening kingdoms was no longer viable when confronting an opponent that grew stronger through territorial conquest rather than weaker through extended warfare. The resources that Viking forces could extract from conquered territories, combined with their ability to recruit additional warriors from Scandinavian homelands, meant that delays in confronting their expansion would only increase the ultimate challenge that Wessex would face. The military advisors who counselled Æthelred during the crucial deliberations regarding Mercian assistance presented detailed analyses of the strategic implications of various policy options, drawing on intelligence gathered from Northumbrian refugees and continental sources who had observed Viking operations in Frankish territories. Their assessments emphasised that Viking military capabilities had evolved far beyond traditional Scandinavian raiding methods to incorporate sophisticated siege techniques, coordinated multi-unit operations, and logistical systems that could sustain extended campaigns across vast territories. The advisors' recommendations stressed that effective resistance required immediate action, while Viking forces remained occupied with consolidating their Northumbrian conquests, as delays would only provide the enemy with additional time to strengthen their positions and recruit reinforcements. The ecclesiastical councillors who participated in these strategic discussions brought perspectives that extended beyond purely military considerations, as their extensive correspondence with continental religious leaders provided access to intelligence regarding Viking administrative policies and territorial governance methods. Their reports described the pragmatic approach that Viking rulers had adopted toward Christian institutions in conquered territories, revealing a willingness to protect cooperative religious establishments while ruthlessly destroying those that resisted their authority. This intelligence suggested that successful resistance required not merely military effectiveness, but also careful coordination between secular and religious authorities to maintain the social cohesion necessary for sustained warfare. The fiscal advisors who analysed the economic implications of military intervention in Mercia provided sobering assessments of the resource requirements that such operations would demand, as supporting extended campaigns beyond West Saxon territories would strain the kingdom's financial capabilities while potentially exposing the homeland to attack if enemy forces avoided the main Anglo-Saxon armies. The calculations revealed that traditional sources of royal revenue were insufficient to support the expanded military establishment that effective assistance to Mercia would require, necessitating innovative financing mechanisms that could generate additional resources without creating undue hardship for populations whose support remained essential for successful resistance. The decision that Æthelred ultimately reached reflected a careful balancing of strategic necessity against practical limitations, as he recognised that Mercia's survival as an independent kingdom was crucial for West Saxon security, while acknowledging that unlimited military commitment could exhaust resources needed for defending Wessex itself. The terms of the military assistance agreement that emerged from these deliberations provided for West Saxon participation in joint operations against Viking forces, while maintaining clear limitations on the scope and duration of such commitments. The agreement included provisions for shared intelligence operations, coordinated supply arrangements, and unified command structures during specific campaigns, while preserving each kingdom's ultimate authority over its own military forces. The military preparations that began throughout West Saxon territories during the summer of 867 demonstrated the kingdom's commitment to effective participation in joint operations, while revealing the organisational challenges that such cooperation would create. The expansion of existing military units to accommodate the additional personnel required for extended campaigns beyond traditional West Saxon territories demanded careful coordination between central authorities and local commanders who possessed detailed knowledge of their region's military capabilities. The integration of specialised units equipped for siege warfare, cavalry operations, and river-based transportation reflected lessons learned from analysing Viking tactical methods and represented significant innovations in Anglo-Saxon military organisation. The intelligence sharing arrangements that accompanied the military alliance provided both kingdoms with access to information sources that neither could have developed independently, as West Saxon spy networks in Viking-controlled territories were combined with Mercian contacts among continental allies who possessed detailed knowledge of Scandinavian political developments. The communication systems that emerged from this cooperation enabled rapid transmission of crucial intelligence across the extensive territories that joint operations would cover, while analytical capabilities were enhanced through the combination of expertise from both kingdoms' advisory structures. The resulting intelligence apparatus provided unprecedented insights into Viking strategic planning, logistical arrangements, and political relationships that would prove invaluable during subsequent military campaigns. The diplomatic initiatives that accompanied military preparations reflected Æthelred's recognition that effective resistance to Viking expansion required broader cooperation among all remaining independent Anglo-Saxon territories, as the resources that Wessex and Mercia could mobilise remained insufficient to match the combined strength of Viking-controlled kingdoms. The embassies sent to Kent, Sussex, and the remaining independent territories in East Anglia carried proposals for comprehensive defensive alliances that would coordinate military operations while respecting the traditional autonomy that smaller kingdoms had maintained despite their nominal subordination to larger neighbours. The negotiations required careful attention to the sovereignty concerns that remained paramount for local rulers, while emphasising the common interests that all Anglo-Saxon territories shared in preventing further Viking expansion. The first joint military operation between West Saxon and Mercian forces took place during the autumn of 867, when Viking raiders launched probing attacks against Mercian frontier settlements to test the effectiveness of the new defensive arrangements. The coordinated response that Æthelred and Burgred organised demonstrated both the potential benefits and practical limitations of inter-kingdom military cooperation, as communication difficulties and command structure ambiguities created operational challenges that required immediate attention. The engagement itself proved tactically successful, as the combined Anglo-Saxon forces were able to repel Viking attacks while inflicting significant casualties on enemy raiding parties, but the coordination problems that emerged during the operation revealed the need for more sophisticated joint command arrangements. The lessons learned from this initial cooperation influenced the development of more effective joint operational procedures, as both kingdoms recognized that successful resistance to Viking territorial ambitions required seamless coordination between forces that had traditionally operated independently. The establishment of unified command structures during specific campaigns, the development of standardized communication protocols, and the creation of integrated supply systems represented significant innovations in Anglo-Saxon military organization that would influence defensive strategies throughout the remainder of the Viking crisis. The training exercises that both kingdoms conducted during the winter months of 867 868 provided opportunities to refine these cooperative procedures while identifying additional areas where coordination could be improved. The strategic implications of the alliance extended beyond immediate military cooperation to encompass broader questions of Anglo-Saxon political unity and cultural identity that would influence relationships between the kingdoms for generations to come. The shared experiences of joint military operations created personal bonds between nobles from both kingdoms, while demonstrating the practical benefits of cooperation over traditional competitive relationships. The exchange of military techniques, administrative practices, and cultural traditions that accompanied these operations contributed to a gradual convergence of governmental methods and social customs that would facilitate future cooperation during subsequent crises. The marriage alliance that strengthened the political bonds between Wessex and Mercia represented a diplomatic masterstroke that transformed temporary military cooperation into lasting dynastic connections with far-reaching implications for Anglo-Saxon political development. Alfred's marriage to Æthelred, a Mercian noblewoman whose family connections provided access to influential political networks throughout the Midlands, created formal kinship ties that would survive the immediate military crisis while establishing precedents for future inter-kingdom relationships. The negotiations that preceded this marriage required careful attention to the concerns of both kingdoms regarding sovereignty and succession rights, as the alliance needed to strengthen cooperation without creating opportunities for either kingdom to dominate the other. The selection of Æthelred as Alfred's bride reflected sophisticated diplomatic calculations that extended far beyond traditional considerations of dowry arrangements and territorial advantages, as her family's political connections provided access to Mercian noble networks that could prove crucial for maintaining effective cooperation during extended military campaigns. Her father's position within the Mercian administrative hierarchy ensured that the marriage would be viewed favourably by influential nobles whose support was essential for sustaining joint operations, while her personal qualities and educational background prepared her for the complex role that she would play in maintaining diplomatic relationships between the two kingdoms. The wedding ceremony itself, conducted with elaborate ritual that emphasized the political significance of the union, provided opportunities for extensive consultations between nobles from both kingdoms regarding strategic planning and resource allocation for future military operations. The celebrations that accompanied the marriage created informal settings where military commanders, administrative officials, and diplomatic representatives could develop personal relationships that would facilitate coordination during subsequent crises. The symbolic elements of the ceremony, which incorporated traditions from both kingdoms while emphasizing their shared Christian heritage, reinforced the cultural bonds that supported political cooperation. The broader implications of the marriage alliance extended throughout Anglo-Saxon political culture, as other kingdoms recognized the strategic advantages that formal dynastic connections could provide during periods of external threat. The precedent established by the West Saxon-Mercian alliance encouraged similar diplomatic initiatives among smaller kingdoms, creating a network of formal relationships that enhanced coordination capabilities while maintaining the traditional autonomy that remained crucial for local political stability. The gradual development of these interconnected alliances represented a significant evolution in Anglo-Saxon political organisation that would influence governmental structures long after the immediate Viking crisis had passed. The joint military campaigns that followed the establishment of formal alliance arrangements demonstrated both the potential effectiveness and practical limitations of coordinated Anglo-Saxon resistance to Viking territorial expansion. The combined forces that Æthelred and Burgred assembled during the spring of 868 represented the largest Anglo-Saxon army that had been fielded since the beginning of the Viking crisis, incorporating specialised units from both kingdoms, along with auxiliary forces provided by allied territories. The logistical arrangements required to sustain such a large military force demanded unprecedented coordination between administrative systems that had previously operated independently, while command structures needed to balance the authority requirements of both rulers with the tactical flexibility necessary for effective field operations. The campaign objectives that emerged from strategic consultations between West Saxon and Mercian military advisors reflected careful analysis of Viking defensive arrangements and operational patterns, as intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces had concentrated their strength in fortified positions that could only be reduced through coordinated siege operations. The decision to focus initial efforts on disrupting Viking supply lines rather than attempting direct assaults on major strongholds demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the logistical vulnerabilities that sustained enemy territorial control. The systematic approach to targeting Viking communication networks, transportation routes, and resource extraction operations represented a significant evolution in Anglo-Saxon strategic thinking that reflected lessons learned from observing enemy administrative methods. The intelligence that reached the combined West Saxon and Mercian command during the winter of 868-869 painted an increasingly alarming picture of Viking strategic planning, as reports from agents operating within enemy-controlled territories confirmed that the Great Heathen Army was preparing to exploit the seasonal campaigning pause to consolidate their territorial gains while positioning forces for renewed expansion. The systematic nature of their preparations, including the construction of additional fortified bases along crucial river systems and the recruitment of fresh warriors from Scandinavian homelands, demonstrated that their previous conquests represented merely the foundation for more ambitious territorial objectives. Most concerning were the detailed reports describing Viking diplomatic initiatives among the surviving East Anglian nobility, where enemy agents had been actively cultivating relationships with nobles who remained bitter about their kingdom's subjugation and might be persuaded to collaborate in exchange for improved positions within the emerging Scandinavian administrative structure. The East Anglian situation had deteriorated dramatically since the initial Viking conquest, as the martyrdom of King Edmund during the autumn of 869 had transformed what had been a relatively pragmatic occupation into a source of religious and political inspiration that threatened to destabilise Viking control throughout their territorial empire. Edmund's execution, carried out with deliberate brutality designed to discourage resistance among other Anglo-Saxon rulers, had instead created precisely the opposite effect that Viking leaders had intended. The circumstances of his death, which contemporary accounts describe in harrowing detail involving torture and eventual beheading after his refusal to renounce his Christian faith or acknowledge Scandinavian authority, had elevated him from a defeated monarch into a powerful symbol of Christian resistance against pagan domination. The religious dimensions of Edmund's martyrdom resonated far beyond East Anglian borders, as reports of his steadfast faith during torture spread throughout Anglo-Saxon territories and created a rallying point for Christian resistance that Viking leaders had not anticipated. The miraculous elements that popular tradition quickly attached to his death, including accounts of his severed head calling out to searchers and the incorruptible state of his remains, provided powerful symbolic resources for clerical leaders who sought to frame the Viking conflict in explicitly religious terms rather than merely political or territorial ones. The shrine that developed around Edmund's burial site became a pilgrimage destination that attracted visitors from throughout Anglo-Saxon England, creating networks of communication and shared purpose that transcended traditional kingdom boundaries. The strategic vacuum that Edmund's death created within East Anglian political structures presented both opportunities and challenges for Viking administrators who found themselves governing populations whose loyalty had been crystallized around religious opposition to Scandinavian rule. The traditional mechanisms of Anglo-Saxon governance, which had depended heavily on personal relationships between rulers and nobility, had been severely disrupted by the systematic elimination of established political hierarchies that had accompanied Viking conquest. The Scandinavian administrators who attempted to fill these roles possessed military effectiveness and administrative competence, but lacked the cultural legitimacy and local knowledge necessary for governing populations, whose cooperation remained essential for extracting the resources needed to sustain continued military operations. The intelligence networks that Æthelred had established within East Anglian territories provided detailed information regarding the growing instability that characterized Viking administration of the conquered kingdom, as reports described increasing incidents of passive resistance, sabotage of military installations, and coordination between surviving Anglo-Saxon nobles who remained committed to eventual restoration of native rule. The communication systems that connected these resistance networks with external Anglo-Saxon territories created opportunities for coordinated action that could potentially destabilize Viking control while providing strategic advantages for any military intervention that might be attempted. The detailed knowledge of local geography, defensive installations, and population centres that these networks provided would prove invaluable for planning effective military operations within enemy-controlled territory. The decision-making process that led to Æthelred's commitment to military intervention in East Anglia reflected complex strategic calculations that balanced the potential benefits of destabilizing Viking territorial control against the substantial risks that such operations would create for West Saxon security. The military advisors who counselled the king during these crucial deliberations presented detailed analyses of Viking defensive arrangements within East Anglia, drawing on intelligence gathered through spy networks and refugee testimonies to assess the feasibility of successful military operations within enemy territory. Their assessments emphasised that Viking forces had concentrated their strength in major urban centres and river crossing points, while maintaining relatively light control over rural areas where Anglo-Saxon resistance networks remained active. The ecclesiastical advisors who participated in strategic planning brought perspectives that emphasised the religious significance of Edmund's martyrdom and the potential for leveraging popular devotion to his memory as a strategic asset during military operations. Their correspondence with surviving East Anglian clergy provided detailed intelligence regarding population attitudes toward Viking rule and the extent of support that might be expected for liberation efforts. The reports they received described widespread resentment among Christian populations who had been subjected to heavy taxation, forced labour, and religious persecution, creating conditions that could potentially be exploited through carefully planned military intervention. The fiscal considerations that influenced planning for the East Anglian campaign required careful analysis of the resource requirements that extended operations within enemy territory would demand, as maintaining supply lines across hostile territory while conducting siege operations against fortified positions would strain West Saxon financial capabilities. The innovative financing mechanisms that royal advisors developed to address these challenges included arrangements for extracting resources from liberated territories, coordination with Mercian allies for shared logistical support, and agreements with surviving East Anglian nobles for contributions to military operations in exchange for restoration of their traditional privileges. The complex financial arrangements that emerged from these negotiations demonstrated the sophisticated economic planning that 9th century military operations required. The military preparations that began throughout West Saxon territories during the early months of 869 reflected lessons learned from previous joint operations with Mercian allies while incorporating tactical innovations designed to address the specific challenges that fighting within enemy-controlled territory would create. The expansion of cavalry units equipped for rapid movement across the flat terrain that characterised much of East Anglia represented a significant departure from traditional West Saxon military organisation, which had historically emphasised infantry formations suited to the hilly geography of their homeland. The recruitment and training of specialised siege units capable of reducing the fortified positions that Viking forces had established at crucial strategic locations required expertise that had to be acquired through consultation with continental military specialists who possessed experience in advanced siege warfare techniques. The intelligence-gathering operations that expanded in preparation for the East Anglian campaign created unprecedented capabilities for monitoring enemy movements and assessing the effectiveness of Viking defensive arrangements throughout their territorial empire. The spy networks that had previously focused on gathering information about military activities were reorganized to provide detailed intelligence regarding administrative policies, economic exploitation methods, and population control techniques that sustained Viking territorial governance. The analytical capabilities that emerged from this expanded intelligence apparatus provided strategic planners with sophisticated understanding of Viking strengths and vulnerabilities that would prove crucial during subsequent military operations. Alfred's participation in the East Anglian expedition represented his first opportunity to exercise independent military command while working in coordination with his brother's overall strategic direction, creating a joint leadership structure that balanced Æthelred's ultimate authority with Alfred's tactical expertise and detailed knowledge of enemy capabilities. The command arrangements that emerged from their consultations reflected careful consideration of the practical requirements for coordinating complex military operations, while maintaining the clear chain of authority that effective battlefield leadership demanded. Alfred's responsibility for cavalry operations and rapid response units provided him with opportunities to demonstrate his military capabilities while contributing specialised expertise that complemented Æthelred's strengths in strategic planning and diplomatic coordination. The logistical arrangements required to sustain military operations within East Anglian territory demanded unprecedented coordination between West Saxon administrative systems and the resistance networks that had maintained clandestine operations within enemy-controlled areas. The supply chains that emerged from these arrangements incorporated traditional military logistics with innovative methods for extracting resources from hostile territory while maintaining the security necessary to prevent Viking interdiction of crucial supply lines. The communication systems that connected field commanders with both West Saxon administrative centres and local resistance networks created information flows that enabled rapid adaptation to changing tactical situations while maintaining strategic coordination across the entire theatre of operations. The initial phases of the East Anglian campaign, launched during the late spring of 869, demonstrated both the potential effectiveness and inherent limitations of military operations conducted within enemy-controlled territory, as West Saxon forces achieved tactical successes against isolated Viking positions, while confronting the strategic challenges that sustained operations across hostile terrain created. The coordination between regular military units and local resistance networks proved more effective than strategic planners had anticipated, as Anglo-Saxon populations provided crucial intelligence regarding enemy movements while offering logistical support that reduced the burden on formal supply systems. The enthusiasm with which liberated communities welcomed West Saxon forces created opportunities for recruitment and resource extraction that partially offset the costs of extended military operations. The tactical challenges that emerged during these early engagements revealed the extent to which Viking military organisation had evolved since their initial conquest of East Anglia, as enemy forces demonstrated sophisticated defensive techniques and coordinated response capabilities that differed significantly from the raiding tactics that had characterised their earlier operations. The fortified positions that Viking commanders had established at crucial river crossings and road junctions incorporated advanced engineering techniques that made direct assault extremely costly, while their mobile reserve units possessed the tactical flexibility necessary to respond rapidly to threats against different portions of their defensive network. The siege warfare that these defensive arrangements necessitated required tactical innovations that stretched West Saxon military capabilities while providing valuable experience in the advanced combat techniques that would prove essential during subsequent campaigns. The intelligence gathered during these initial operations provided detailed insights into Viking command structures, communication systems, and logistical arrangements that had previously been unavailable to Anglo-Saxon strategic planners, as direct observation of enemy operational methods revealed both strengths and vulnerabilities that could be exploited during future engagements. The reports that field commanders submitted regarding Viking tactical formations, weapon technologies, and battlefield coordination techniques demonstrated the professional military capabilities that Scandinavian forces had developed through their extensive European campaigns. However, these same reports also identified weaknesses in Viking garrison arrangements, supply distribution systems, and coordination between different units that suggested potential opportunities for more effective tactical approaches. The psychological impact of the East Anglian campaign extended far beyond its immediate military results, as the demonstration that Viking territorial control could be challenged through coordinated military action provided encouragement for resistance movements throughout Scandinavian occupied territories, while simultaneously creating strategic pressures that forced enemy commanders to divert resources from offensive operations to defensive preparations. The symbolic significance of West Saxon forces operating successfully within territory that had been considered securely under Viking control challenged assumptions about Scandinavian military invincibility, while providing concrete evidence that effective resistance remained possible despite the overwhelming challenges that Anglo-Saxon kingdoms faced. The religious dimensions of the campaign gained additional significance as West Saxon forces encountered the shrine that had developed around Edmund's burial site, where the continuing stream of pilgrims and the miraculous accounts associated with the martyred king's remains provided powerful evidence of the spiritual resources that sustained Anglo-Saxon resistance to pagan domination. The decision to incorporate formal recognition of Edmund's sanctity into the campaign's objectives reflected Æthelred's sophisticated understanding of the ways that religious symbolism could be leveraged to strengthen popular support for military operations, while creating lasting bonds between liberated populations and their West Saxon liberators. The tactical lessons that emerged from fighting the great heathen army on the unfamiliar terrain of East Anglia forced significant modifications to traditional West Saxon military doctrine, as the flat, marshy landscape that characterised much of the region required tactical approaches that differed substantially from the hill and valley warfare that had shaped Anglo-Saxon military traditions. The cavalry operations that proved most effective in this environment demanded coordination between mounted units and infantry formations that had not been emphasised in previous West Saxon military training, while the river-based transportation systems that provided crucial logistical advantages required naval capabilities that stretched existing resources. The engineering challenges that siege operations against Viking fortifications created necessitated technical expertise that had to be acquired through consultation with specialists who possessed experience in continental European warfare. The coordination challenges that joint operations with Æthelred created during the East Anglian campaign, provided valuable experience in the command relationships and communication systems that would prove essential during subsequent military crises, as both brothers learned to balance independent tactical authority with overall strategic coordination. The division of responsibilities that emerged during these operations reflected their complementary strengths and expertise, while establishing precedents for future cooperation that would influence West Saxon military organisation for years to come. Alfred's demonstrated competence in cavalry command and rapid response operations provided evidence of his military capabilities while creating the foundation for his eventual assumption of independent authority during subsequent phases of the Viking conflict. The deteriorating situation in East Anglia during the autumn of 870 created the strategic conditions that Viking commanders had long anticipated, as their systematic consolidation of conquered territories provided the logistical foundation necessary for launching the decisive assault on Wessex that would complete their domination of Anglo-Saxon England. The intelligence networks that the Great Heathen Army had developed during their 4-year occupation of eastern and northern territories provided detailed knowledge of West Saxon defensive capabilities, political vulnerabilities, and resource limitations that enabled sophisticated strategic planning for what their leaders recognized would be the most challenging phase of their territorial conquest campaign. The timing of their advance coincided with the harvest season, when West Saxon forces would be dispersed throughout the kingdom's agricultural regions and unable to concentrate rapidly for coordinated resistance. The Viking army that crossed into West Saxon territory during late 870 represented the culmination of years of military evolution, incorporating tactical innovations developed through extensive European campaigns, with organisational structures refined during their administration of conquered Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Archaeological evidence from their route of advance reveals the sophisticated logistical arrangements that sustained this massive military operation, including supply depots established at strategic river crossings, workshops for maintaining weapons and equipment, and communication systems that enabled coordination between widely separated units. The army's composition reflected the international character of 9th century Scandinavian expansion, drawing warriors from Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish territories who were united by shared cultural traditions and common expectations of territorial enrichment rather than narrow dynastic loyalties. The leadership structure that directed this invasion force demonstrated the political sophistication that Viking commanders had developed through their governance of conquered territories, as the army operated under a council system that balanced the authority of established jarls with the tactical expertise of experienced war leaders who had proven their effectiveness during previous campaigns. The two kings who shared overall command of the expedition, identified in contemporary sources as Bagsec and Halfden, possessed complementary strengths that enabled effective coordination of the complex military and administrative activities that territorial conquest required. Bagsec's reputation as a tactical innovator who had developed many of the siege techniques that enabled Viking forces to capture fortified positions was balanced by Halfden's administrative expertise and diplomatic skills that had proven crucial for governing conquered populations. The strategic intelligence that guided Viking planning for the Wessex invasion incorporated detailed analysis of the defensive arrangements that Æthelred had implemented during his 5-year reign, as enemy agents had systematically mapped West Saxon fortifications, supply routes, and communication networks, while assessing the military capabilities of individual aldermen and their regional forces. The reports that Viking commanders possessed regarding West Saxon political dynamics revealed their sophisticated understanding of the factional tensions that existed within the kingdom's nobility, knowledge that they intended to exploit through diplomatic initiatives designed to encourage defections among nobles, who might be persuaded that collaboration offered better prospects than resistance. The timing of their advance had been carefully calculated to coincide with seasonal patterns that would minimise West Saxon mobility while maximising the invaders' logistical advantages. Æthelred's response to the intelligence reports that confirmed Viking territorial ambitions demonstrated the strategic maturity that he had developed through 5 years of crisis management, as his immediate orders reflected careful analysis of enemy capabilities and clear understanding of the defensive principles that offered the best prospects for successful resistance. Rather than attempting to prevent Viking entry into West Saxon territory through frontier defence, which would have dispersed his forces and enabled enemy commanders to exploit their superior mobility, the king implemented a strategic withdrawal that concentrated West Saxon military strength in carefully selected defensive positions while maintaining the flexibility necessary for effective counterattacks. The beacon systems that had been established throughout the kingdom during previous years provided rapid communication capabilities that enabled coordinated responses to enemy movements across extensive territories. The fortified positions that served as anchors for West Saxon defensive strategy had been carefully selected during the preceding years of military preparation, incorporating lessons learned from analysing Viking siege techniques and tactical preferences observed during their conquest of other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The strongholds at Reading, Wallingford, and other crucial river crossings combined natural defensive advantages with artificial fortifications that could withstand the siege equipment and assault techniques that characterised Viking military operations. The supply arrangements that connected these defensive positions created a network of mutual support that enabled besieged garrisons to maintain resistance, while providing bases from which relief operations could be launched against enemy forces that became committed to prolonged siege operations. The mobilisation orders that Æthelred issued throughout West Saxon territories during the final months of 870 reflected the comprehensive military reforms that had been implemented during his reign, as the expanded Fyrd system provided both the manpower necessary for sustained resistance and the organisational flexibility required for coordinating complex defensive operations. The regional commanders who received these orders possessed detailed knowledge of their territory's defensive capabilities and had participated in training exercises that prepared them for the coordination challenges that multi-unit operations would create. The standardised equipment and tactical procedures that had been introduced during recent years enabled effective cooperation between forces from different regions, while ensuring that individual units could operate independently when circumstances required tactical flexibility. The intelligence-gathering operations that accelerated as Viking forces advanced into West Saxon territory provided crucial information regarding enemy strength, organisational structure, and strategic objectives that enabled effective defensive planning while revealing potential vulnerabilities that might be exploited through carefully planned counterattacks. The spy networks that had been established within Viking-controlled territories during previous years provided detailed reports regarding the composition of the invading army, the command relationships that governed its operations, and the logistical arrangements that sustained its advance. The analytical capabilities that West Saxon advisors had developed through years of studying enemy operational methods enabled sophisticated interpretation of this intelligence data, providing strategic planners with insights into Viking intentions and capabilities that would prove crucial during subsequent military operations. The Battle of Englefield, fought on December 31st, 870, marked the first major engagement between West Saxon forces and the Great Heathen Army's main invasion force, providing both kingdoms with their initial assessment of enemy capabilities while establishing tactical precedents that would influence subsequent military operations throughout the campaign. The Viking force that advanced against the West Saxon position at Englefield represented a substantial portion of the invading army's strength, including elite units that had spearheaded previous conquest campaigns and specialised siege equipment designed to reduce the fortified positions that characterised West Saxon defensive strategy. The commanders who led this assault including the Jarl Sidrak, whose reputation for tactical innovation had been established during the conquest of Northumbria, possessed extensive experience in reducing Anglo-Saxon defensive positions and confident expectations of achieving another decisive victory that would open the path to Winchester. The West Saxon defensive position at Englefield had been selected by Ealdorman Æthelwulf of Berkshire, whose detailed knowledge of local geography enabled him to identify terrain features that could be exploited to neutralise the mobility advantages that typically gave Viking forces decisive tactical superiority. The hill position that his forces occupied provided clear fields of observation across the approaches that enemy forces would be required to use, while the marshy ground that protected the flanks of his defensive line would channel Viking attacks into narrow frontages where superior numbers could not be effectively employed. The fortifications that had been constructed during previous months incorporated lessons learned from analysing Viking siege techniques, including obstacles designed to disrupt cavalry charges and defensive works that could withstand the projectile weapons that characterise Scandinavian military technology. The tactical deployment that Æthelwulf implemented for the Englefield engagement reflected sophisticated understanding of Viking combat methods and demonstrated the evolution that West Saxon military doctrine had undergone during years of crisis preparation. The infantry formations that anchored his defensive line incorporated shield wall techniques that had been refined through training exercises designed to address the specific challenges that Viking weapon systems created, while specialised units equipped with long-range projectile weapons were positioned to exploit the targeting opportunities that the defensive terrain would provide. The cavalry reserve that remained concealed behind the main defensive position possessed the mobility necessary to exploit tactical opportunities while providing the flexibility required to respond to unexpected developments during the engagement. The Viking assault that commenced during the early morning hours of December the 31st demonstrated the tactical sophistication that Scandinavian military organisation had achieved through years of European campaigning, as coordinated attacks by infantry, cavalry and archer units tested different portions of the West Saxon defensive line, while siege equipment provided supporting fire against fortified positions. The initial probing attacks revealed the strength of Anglo-Saxon defensive arrangements, while identifying potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited through more concentrated assault efforts. The systematic nature of these preliminary operations reflected the professional military capabilities that Viking commanders had developed, as they gathered tactical intelligence regarding enemy defensive methods while minimising casualties among their elite units. The decisive phase of the engagement began when Viking forces committed their main assault units to a concentrated attack against what their commanders had identified as the weakest section of the West Saxon defensive line, employing the coordinated infantry and cavalry tactics that had proven successful during previous conquest campaigns. The ferocity of this assault tested the discipline and training that West Saxon forces had received during years of military preparation, as the psychological pressure created by Viking war cries and the physical challenges posed by their advanced weapon systems created conditions that had broken the resistance of other Anglo-Saxon armies. However, the defensive preparations that Æthelwulf had implemented enabled his forces to maintain their formations while inflicting substantial casualties on attacking enemy units. The turning point of the battle occurred when West Saxon cavalry units, operating from concealed positions that had not been detected by Viking reconnaissance, launched coordinated counterattacks against enemy forces that had become committed to frontal assaults against the main defensive line. The timing of these counterattacks exploited the tactical vulnerabilities that Viking assault formations created when they focused their attention on reducing fortified positions, as the mobility and shock effect of mounted units proved devastatingly effective against infantry formations that lack the flexibility necessary to respond to attacks from unexpected directions. The psychological impact of these counterattacks was amplified by the surprise that West Saxon forces achieved as Viking commanders had not anticipated the tactical sophistication that their opponents demonstrated. The casualties that Viking forces sustained during the Englefield engagement included several prominent commanders whose deaths significantly disrupted enemy command structures while providing West Saxon intelligence services with valuable information regarding Scandinavian military organisation and tactical procedures. The death of Jarl Sidrak, whose tactical expertise had been crucial for Viking siege operations during previous campaigns, eliminated one of the most experienced commanders within the Great Heathen Army, while creating succession disputes that would complicate enemy strategic planning during subsequent phases of the invasion. The weapons and equipment captured during the West Saxon victory provided detailed intelligence regarding Viking military technology, while supplying resources that would prove valuable during future engagements. The strategic implications of the Englefield victory extended far beyond its immediate tactical results, as the demonstration that Viking forces could be defeated through effective defensive planning and coordinated tactical execution provided crucial encouragement for West Saxon resistance, while simultaneously creating strategic pressures that forced enemy commanders to reconsider their invasion timeline and resource allocation. The intelligence that West Saxon forces gathered during the engagement revealed important details regarding Viking organisational structures, command relationships, and tactical preferences that would influence defensive planning throughout the remainder of the campaign. The confidence that the victory provided to West Saxon military leadership enabled more aggressive tactical approaches during subsequent engagements, while demonstrating to allied kingdoms that effective resistance to Viking territorial ambitions remained possible. The aftermath of Englefield created immediate challenges for Viking strategic planning, as the substantial casualties that their forces had sustained reduced their available manpower, while the intelligence that West Saxon forces had gathered regarding their operational methods necessitated significant modifications to tactical procedures that had previously proven effective. The delay that these adjustments required provided Æthelred with crucial time for consolidating his defensive arrangements, while coordinating with Mercian allies who had committed to providing military assistance during the crisis. The psychological impact of the defeat on Viking morale, while difficult to assess through contemporary sources, appears to have created tensions within the army's command structure that would influence their decision-making during subsequent phases of the campaign. The intelligence reports that reached Viking commanders during the weeks following Englefield confirmed that their initial assessment of West Saxon military capabilities had significantly underestimated the tactical sophistication and defensive preparations that Æthelred's forces possessed, necessitating fundamental revisions to the strategic planning that had guided their invasion preparations. The detailed analysis of the engagement that enemy commanders conducted revealed the extent to which West Saxon military doctrine had evolved during the preceding years, incorporating tactical innovations and organisational reforms that addressed the specific challenges that Viking operational methods created. The recognition that their opponents possessed both the military capabilities and strategic understanding necessary for effective resistance forced Viking leaders to abandon their expectations of rapid conquest in favour of more methodical approaches that would require substantial additional resources and extended campaign timelines. The strategic recalibrations that Viking commanders implemented following their defeat at Englefield reflected a fundamental shift in their approach to the conquest of Wessex, as the tactical sophistication that West Saxon forces had demonstrated forced enemy leaders to abandon their expectations of rapid territorial subjugation in favour of more methodical siege warfare, designed to systematically reduce the fortified positions that anchored Æthelred's defensive strategy. The establishment of a permanent Viking base at Reading during the opening weeks of January 871 represented this new approach, as Scandinavian forces constructed extensive earthwork fortifications at the confluence of the Thames and Kennet rivers that would serve as both a secure supply depot and a staging area for coordinated attacks against West Saxon strongholds throughout the Thames Valley region. The fortified camp that emerged at Reading during these crucial weeks incorporated advanced engineering techniques that Viking forces had developed through their extensive European campaigns, including multiple defensive perimeters designed to withstand prolonged siege operations and specialized facilities for maintaining the siege equipment that would be essential for reducing Anglo-Saxon fortifications. Archaeological evidence from the site reveals the sophisticated logistical arrangements that sustained this installation, including workshops for weapon maintenance, storage facilities for provisions and plunder, and communication systems that enabled coordination with other Viking-controlled territories throughout eastern England. The strategic location provided the army with control over river transportation routes that connected the Thames estuary with the interior regions where West Saxon power was concentrated, while the defensive advantages of the site made it virtually impregnable to direct assault by Anglo-Saxon forces. The intelligence networks that operated from this base provided Viking commanders with detailed information regarding West Saxon defensive arrangements, troop movements, and supply systems that enabled sophisticated planning for the systematic reduction of enemy resistance throughout the region. The spy operations that emanated from Reading incorporated both traditional reconnaissance activities and more sophisticated intelligence gathering techniques that exploited the commercial and administrative networks that connected different portions of West Saxon territory. The information that these operations provided regarding the locations of royal treasure, the defensive capabilities of individual strongholds, and the political relationships that sustained local resistance proved invaluable for planning the coordinated attacks that would characterize the next phase of Viking operations. Æthelred's response to the establishment of the Reading base demonstrated the strategic maturity that he developed through years of crisis management, as his orders reflected careful analysis of the tactical challenges that confronting a fortified enemy position would create, while maintaining focus on the broader defensive objectives that would determine the ultimate outcome of the campaign. Rather than attempting immediate assault operations against the Viking fortifications, which would have played to enemy strengths while exposing West Saxon forces to devastating casualties, the king implemented a comprehensive strategy that combined economic warfare designed to disrupt Viking supply lines with tactical operations aimed at preventing enemy expansion beyond their fortified perimeter. The Battle of Basing, fought on January 22, 871, emerged from this strategic context as Viking forces launched their first major offensive operation from their Reading base, targeting the West Saxon stronghold at Basing, whose capture would provide them with control over crucial transportation routes, while eliminating a key anchor point in the defensive network that protected the approaches to Winchester. The Viking army that advanced against Basing represented a substantial portion of the great heathen army's available strength, including the elite units that had spearheaded their previous conquest campaigns and specialized siege equipment designed specifically for reducing the type of fortified positions that characterized West Saxon defensive strategy. The tactical deployment that Viking commanders implemented for the Basing assault reflected lessons learned from their defeat at Englefield, incorporating modifications designed to address the defensive innovations that West Saxon forces had demonstrated during that engagement. The coordinated approach that combined direct assault operations with flanking maneuvers intended to exploit potential weaknesses in Anglo-Saxon defensive arrangements demonstrated the adaptability that had enabled Scandinavian forces to achieve success against diverse opponents throughout Europe. The siege equipment that accompanied the attacking force included advanced projectile weapons and battering devices that represented the most sophisticated military technology available during the 9th century. The West Saxon defensive position at Basing had been strengthened during the preceding months through construction projects that incorporated intelligence gathered regarding Viking siege techniques and tactical preferences observed during their conquest of other Anglo-Saxon strongholds. The fortifications that protected the settlement included multiple defensive perimeters designed to channel attacking forces into killing zones where concentrated defensive fire could be most effectively employed, while the supply arrangements that connected the stronghold with other West Saxon positions enabled the garrison to maintain resistance during extended siege operations. The commanders responsible for the defence possessed detailed knowledge of local geography and had participated in training exercises that prepared them for the coordination challenges that prolonged siege warfare would create. The engagement that developed during the early morning hours of January 22nd tested both the tactical innovations that Viking forces had implemented and the defensive preparations that West Saxon commanders had refined through months of strategic planning. The initial assault operations revealed the strength of Anglo-Saxon fortifications while demonstrating the effectiveness of the siege techniques that Scandinavian forces had developed through their European campaigns. The systematic nature of Viking attack methods, which combined coordinated infantry assaults with supporting fire from advanced projectile weapons, created tactical challenges that stretched West Saxon defensive capabilities while providing valuable intelligence regarding enemy operational procedures. The decisive phase of the battle occurred when West Saxon forces implemented tactical innovations that exploited vulnerabilities in Viking assault formations, demonstrating the evolution that Anglo-Saxon military doctrine had undergone during years of intensive preparation for confronting Scandinavian tactical methods. The coordinated counterattacks that characterized this phase of the engagement revealed the sophistication of West Saxon command structures and the effectiveness of the training programs that had prepared individual units for the complex coordination requirements that successful defensive operations demanded. The psychological impact of these tactical successes provided crucial encouragement for Anglo-Saxon resistance, while creating operational challenges for Viking commanders who had not anticipated the level of tactical sophistication that their opponents possessed. However, the ultimate outcome of the basing engagement demonstrated the resource advantages that Viking forces possessed through their control of extensive territorial bases and their ability to sustain casualties that would have been devastating for smaller Anglo-Saxon armies. The prolonged nature of the siege operations that followed the initial assault phase gradually exhausted West Saxon defensive capabilities, while enabling Viking forces to employ the systematic reduction techniques that had proven effective during their conquest of other fortified positions. The fall of basing after several days of intensive fighting provided the Great Heathen Army with a crucial strategic victory that opened transportation routes into the heart of West Saxon territory, while eliminating a key defensive position that had anchored regional resistance efforts. The tactical lessons that emerged from the basing engagement influenced Æthelred's strategic planning for subsequent defensive operations, as the king recognized that static defensive positions, regardless of their individual strength, could not indefinitely withstand the systematic siege techniques and overwhelming resource advantages that Viking forces possessed. The strategic adjustments that followed this recognition emphasized mobility and tactical flexibility over fixed fortifications, incorporating lessons learned from analysing Viking operational methods, while exploiting the geographical advantages that West Saxon forces possessed through their intimate knowledge of local terrain features and transportation networks. The Battle of Meriton, fought on March 22nd, 871, represented the culmination of these strategic adjustments, as Æthelred implemented a more aggressive tactical approach designed to exploit the vulnerabilities that Viking forces created when they extended their operations beyond the secure bases that had sustained their previous successes. The intelligence that guided West Saxon planning for this engagement revealed that Viking commanders had divided their available forces to pursue multiple objectives simultaneously, creating opportunities for concentrated attacks against isolated enemy units that could be defeated before reinforcements could arrive. The timing of the operation coincided with seasonal conditions that favoured West Saxon mobility while creating logistical challenges for Viking supply systems that depended on river transportation. The West Saxon army that Æthelred assembled for the Meryton campaign represented the most sophisticated military force that the kingdom had fielded during the Viking crisis. Incorporating tactical innovations developed through years of analysing enemy operational methods, while maintaining the organisational flexibility necessary for coordinating complex multi-unit operations across extensive territories. The command structure that directed this force reflected careful balancing of experienced leadership with tactical innovation, as veteran commanders who possessed detailed knowledge of Viking capabilities worked in coordination with younger officers who had demonstrated effectiveness during recent engagements. Alfred's role within this command structure provided him with crucial experience in large-scale tactical coordination, while contributing specialised expertise in cavalry operations and rapid response techniques. The tactical deployment that West Saxon forces implemented at Meryton demonstrated the evolution that Anglo-Saxon military doctrine had undergone during the preceding months of intensive warfare, as coordinated infantry and cavalry formations exploited terrain advantages while maintaining the flexibility necessary to respond to the tactical adaptations that Viking commanders would inevitably attempt. The positioning of reserve units at strategic locations enabled rapid reinforcement of threatened positions, while providing opportunities for exploiting tactical successes through coordinated pursuit operations. The communication systems that connected different elements of the West Saxon army enabled effective coordination across the extended battlefield, while maintaining the centralised command authority necessary for implementing complex tactical manoeuvres. The Viking forces that confronted this West Saxon deployment had been weakened by the casualties sustained during previous engagements, and the logistical challenges created by operating at extended distances from their secure bases, factors that reduced their tactical effectiveness while creating vulnerabilities that Anglo-Saxon commanders were prepared to exploit. The intelligence that West Saxon forces possessed regarding enemy strength, organisational structure, and recent operational activities enabled tactical planning that specifically addressed the weaknesses that Viking forces had developed through months of intensive campaigning. The coordination problems that characterised Viking operations during this period reflected the strain that sustained warfare had placed on their command structures and communication systems. The engagement that developed during the morning hours of March 22nd initially favoured West Saxon forces, as their tactical innovations and superior knowledge of local geography enabled them to achieve significant tactical advantages while inflicting substantial casualties on Viking units that had become separated from their main force. The coordinated attacks that characterised the opening phase of the battle demonstrated the effectiveness of the tactical training that West Saxon forces had received, while revealing the extent to which Anglo-Saxon military capabilities had evolved during the crisis period. The psychological impact of these early successes provided crucial encouragement for West Saxon morale, while creating operational challenges for Viking commanders who struggled to maintain unit cohesion under the pressure of sustained Anglo-Saxon attacks. However, the arrival of Viking reinforcements during the afternoon hours fundamentally altered the tactical balance, as fresh enemy units equipped with advanced weapons and commanded by experienced leaders gradually overwhelmed the tactical advantages that West Saxon forces had achieved during the morning engagement. The systematic nature of the Viking counterattack revealed the organisational resilience that had enabled Scandinavian forces to achieve success against numerous European opponents, as their ability to rapidly redeploy available resources and coordinate complex tactical operations under battlefield conditions demonstrated the professional military capabilities that distinguished them from traditional raiding forces. The discipline that Viking units maintained during these operations enabled them to exploit the tactical opportunities that West Saxon exhaustion had created. The ultimate outcome of Meriton represented a strategic setback for West Saxon resistance efforts, as the casualties sustained during the engagement significantly reduced the kingdom's available military strength while demonstrating the limitations that resource constraints placed on Anglo-Saxon tactical options. The intelligence that Viking forces gathered during the battle provided them with detailed information regarding West Saxon military capabilities and organisational structures that would influence their planning for subsequent operations. The psychological impact of the defeat created challenges for maintaining popular support for continued resistance while providing Viking commanders with evidence that their systematic approach to territorial conquest remained fundamentally sound despite temporary tactical setbacks. The strategic implications of the Meriton defeat forced Æthelred to reconsider the defensive strategy that had guided West Saxon resistance during the preceding months, as the demonstration of Viking resilience and tactical adaptability revealed that traditional Anglo-Saxon military methods remained insufficient for achieving decisive victory against such sophisticated opponents. The resource calculations that influenced subsequent planning emphasized the need for innovative approaches that could exploit Viking vulnerabilities while minimizing the casualties that West Saxon forces could not afford to sustain. The diplomatic initiatives that accelerated following Meriton reflected recognition that military resistance alone could not guarantee West Saxon survival without substantial external assistance or fundamental changes in the strategic balance of power. The physical and psychological toll that months of intensive campaigning had exacted on Æthelred became increasingly apparent during the weeks following Meriton, as contemporary sources describe symptoms that suggest the king was suffering from the cumulative effects of battlefield stress, inadequate nutrition, and the constant pressure of decision-making under crisis conditions. The responsibilities that he had carried throughout the Viking crisis, including strategic planning, tactical coordination, diplomatic negotiations, and administrative oversight of a kingdom under siege, had created demands that exceeded the physical capabilities of even the most dedicated ruler. The irregular sleep patterns, limited access to adequate medical care, and psychological pressure created by witnessing the destruction of communities throughout his realm had gradually undermined his health while compromising his ability to provide the leadership that the crisis demanded. The final illness that claimed Æthelred's life during April 871 appears to have resulted from this combination of physical exhaustion and psychological stress, rather than from any specific battlefield injury or infectious disease, as contemporary accounts describe a gradual decline in his condition, rather than sudden onset of symptoms that would suggest acute medical crisis. The king's determination to continue active participation in military planning and administrative oversight, despite his deteriorating health, reflected both his personal commitment to defending his kingdom and his recognition that effective leadership during the crisis required continuous royal presence and decision-making authority. The efforts that his advisors made to persuade him to delegate responsibilities and focus on recovery were unsuccessful, as Æthelred remained convinced that the survival of West Saxon independence depended on his personal involvement in every aspect of the resistance effort. The death of Æthelred on April 15th, 871, occurred at a moment when West Saxon resistance had reached a critical juncture, as Viking forces were preparing for what their commanders anticipated would be the final phase of their conquest campaign, while Anglo-Saxon defensive capabilities had been severely weakened by months of intensive warfare. The timing of the king's death created immediate challenges for the succession process, as the crisis conditions that prevailed throughout the kingdom made traditional ceremonial procedures impossible, while the urgent need for continued military leadership demanded rapid resolution of any potential disputes regarding royal authority. The political stability that had characterized West Saxon government throughout Æthelred's reign provided the foundation for a smooth transition, as the established succession practices and Alfred's demonstrated military capabilities enabled him to assume royal authority without the factional conflicts that might have destroyed Anglo-Saxon resistance during such a crucial moment. Alfred's accession to the throne occurred under circumstances that would have tested the most experienced ruler, as he inherited a kingdom whose military resources had been severely depleted, whose territorial integrity was under immediate threat, and whose survival depended on tactical and strategic innovations that had yet to be successfully implemented against Viking territorial ambitions. The intelligence reports that reached the new king during his first days in power confirmed that enemy forces were preparing for renewed offensive operations that would exploit the disruption that royal succession inevitably created, while the resource assessments that his advisors provided revealed the extent to which months of warfare had strained the kingdom's financial and military capabilities. The diplomatic challenges that accompanied his accession required immediate attention, as allied kingdoms needed reassurance regarding West Saxon commitment to continued resistance, while potential supporters required evidence that the new king possessed the capabilities necessary for effective leadership during the ongoing crisis. The administrative machinery that Alfred inherited upon Æthelred's death bore the unmistakable imprint of his brother's innovative approach to crisis governance, revealing institutional reforms that would prove foundational to the eventual survival and expansion of Anglo-Saxon political authority throughout England. The governmental structures that Æthelred had developed during his 6-year reign represented a sophisticated response to the unprecedented challenges that Viking territorial conquest had created, transforming traditional West Saxon administrative practices through systematic adaptation of continental European techniques and careful integration of lessons learned from analysing Scandinavian governmental methods in conquered territories. The royal chancery that produced official documents had evolved from a modest scriptorium serving primarily ceremonial functions into a comprehensive administrative apparatus capable of coordinating complex military operations, managing diplomatic correspondence with multiple allied kingdoms, and maintaining the detailed financial records that sustained expanded defensive capabilities. The fiscal innovations that Æthelred had implemented during the crisis years established precedents for royal revenue generation that fundamentally altered the relationship between monarchical authority and economic resources throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The traditional sources of royal income, including land rents from royal estates, judicial fines collected through shire courts, and customs duties levied on commercial transactions, had proven inadequate for sustaining the expanded military establishments that effective resistance to Viking conquest required. The supplementary taxation systems that emerged during Æthelred's reign incorporated techniques observed in Frankish territories, where Carolingian administrators had developed sophisticated methods for extracting resources from diverse populations, while maintaining the social stability necessary for sustained military operations. The assessment procedures that West Saxon officials developed for implementing these new taxation methods required detailed surveys of agricultural productivity, commercial activity, and population distribution that created unprecedented administrative capabilities, while establishing governmental precedents that would influence English fiscal policy for centuries. The military reforms that Æthelred had initiated represented perhaps his most significant contribution to the institutional foundations that would enable eventual Anglo-Saxon victory over Viking territorial ambitions, as the organisational innovations that he introduced addressed fundamental weaknesses in traditional Germanic military structures, while incorporating tactical techniques that had proven effective during continental European conflicts. The expanded fyrd system that emerged during his reign balanced the traditional obligations of agricultural populations for seasonal military service with the practical requirements for maintaining professional military units capable of sustained campaigning against sophisticated opponents. The regional commanders who administered this system possessed both military expertise gained through years of combat experience and administrative capabilities that enabled them to coordinate the complex logistical arrangements that mobile warfare demanded. The fortification programs that Æthelred had overseen throughout West Saxon territories established defensive networks that would provide the strategic foundation for Alfred's subsequent military successes, as the systematic approach to constructing and maintaining fortified positions reflected careful analysis of Viking siege capabilities and tactical preferences observed during their conquest of other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The engineering techniques that characterized these installations incorporated innovations developed through consultation with continental military specialists who possessed experience in advanced fortification design, while the strategic positioning of individual strongholds created mutually supporting networks that could sustain coordinated resistance, even when individual positions came under direct attack. The supply systems that connected these fortifications enabled rapid redistribution of resources and personnel in response to changing tactical situations, while the communication networks that linked them provided the information flows necessary for coordinating defensive operations across extensive territories. The intelligence apparatus that Æthelred had developed during his reign represented one of his most sophisticated institutional innovations, creating systematic capabilities for gathering, analysing and disseminating information that far exceeded anything that previous Anglo-Saxon rulers had attempted. The spy networks that operated within Viking-controlled territories provided detailed intelligence regarding enemy military capabilities, administrative policies, and strategic planning that proved invaluable for defensive preparations, while the analytical procedures that West Saxon advisors developed for interpreting this information enabled sophisticated understanding of Scandinavian operational methods and political dynamics. The communication systems that transmitted crucial intelligence across long distances incorporated both traditional messenger services and innovative signalling techniques that could rapidly alert defensive forces to enemy movements while maintaining the security necessary to prevent Viking interdiction of vital information flows. The diplomatic precedents that Æthelred had established through his alliance-building efforts created frameworks for inter-kingdom cooperation that would prove essential for the eventual coordination of Anglo-Saxon resistance under Alfred's leadership, as the formal agreements negotiated during the crisis years addressed fundamental questions regarding sovereignty, resource allocation, and command authority that had previously prevented effective collaboration between competitive kingdoms. The marriage alliance that connected West Saxon and Mercian royal families through Alfred's union with Ealhswith represented the culmination of these diplomatic innovations, creating dynastic bonds that transcended immediate military cooperation while establishing precedents for the political integration that would eventually unite Anglo-Saxon territories under unified royal authority. The negotiation procedures that West Saxon diplomats developed during these alliance-building efforts incorporated continental European diplomatic practices while adapting them to the specific cultural and political conditions that characterized Anglo-Saxon inter-kingdom relationships. The legal innovations that Æthelred had implemented during his reign established important precedents for the expansion of royal judicial authority that would prove crucial for maintaining social cohesion during extended periods of military crisis, as the emergency conditions created by Viking territorial ambitions required modifications to traditional legal procedures while preserving the customary rights that sustained popular support for royal authority. The judicial reforms that emerged during this period balanced the need for rapid decision-making during crisis situations with the procedural safeguards that protected individual rights and maintained community stability. The legal precedents that royal courts established during Æthelred's reign addressed novel situations created by warfare, population displacement, and economic disruption that had no precedent in traditional Anglo-Saxon legal practice, creating jurisprudential foundations that would influence English legal development for generations. The ecclesiastical policies that Æthelred had pursued throughout his reign reflected sophisticated understanding of the Church's potential contributions to effective governance during crisis periods, as his support for religious institutions created networks of literate administrators, while establishing spiritual resources that sustained popular morale during the darkest phases of the Viking conflict. The royal grants to monasteries and cathedral chapters that characterized his reign served multiple purposes beyond traditional expressions of royal piety, creating educational institutions that trained the administrative personnel necessary for expanded governmental operations, while establishing centres of learning that preserved cultural traditions threatened by Scandinavian conquest. The correspondence that West Saxon ecclesiastical leaders maintained with continental religious authorities provided access to advanced administrative techniques and diplomatic intelligence that proved invaluable for strategic planning, while the theological resources that they developed for interpreting the Viking crisis in religious terms created powerful motivational frameworks that sustained resistance efforts. The cultural preservation efforts that Æthelred had supported during his reign established foundations for the intellectual renaissance that would characterize Alfred's subsequent rule, as the king's recognition that effective resistance to Viking conquest required maintenance of the educational and artistic traditions that distinguished Anglo-Saxon civilization from Scandinavian culture, led to systematic efforts to protect manuscripts, support scholarly activities, and maintain the institutional structures that sustained advanced learning. The scriptoria that operated under royal patronage during the crisis years continued producing both administrative documents and literary works despite the disruptions that warfare created, while the educational programs that trained young nobles for governmental service incorporated both traditional Anglo-Saxon learning and innovative techniques adapted from continental European sources. The artistic patronage that Æthelred provided during his reign supported craftsmen who created works that celebrated Anglo-Saxon cultural achievements, while providing symbolic resources that reinforced popular identification with Christian civilization in opposition to pagan conquest. The historiographical assessment of Æthelred's reign that emerged during the immediate aftermath of his death reflected the complex challenges that contemporary observers faced when attempting to evaluate the effectiveness of his policies during a period when their ultimate success remained uncertain. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle entries that recorded his death emphasized his military leadership and personal courage, while acknowledging the territorial losses that had occurred during his reign, creating a balanced assessment that recognized both his achievements and the limitations that external circumstances had imposed on his policy options. The ecclesiastical sources that commented on his reign praised his support for Christian institutions and his personal piety, while noting the difficulties that warfare had created for maintaining traditional religious observances and educational activities. The Frankish annals that mentioned Æthelred's activities provided external perspectives that emphasized the broader European significance of Anglo-Saxon resistance to Viking expansion, as continental observers recognized that the survival of independent English kingdoms represented a crucial factor in limiting Scandinavian territorial ambitions that threatened established political arrangements throughout northwestern Europe. The diplomatic correspondence that Frankish rulers had maintained with Æthelred during his reign revealed the extent to which continental European leaders had viewed West Saxon resistance as an essential component of broader defensive strategies against Viking expansion, while the military assistance that some Frankish nobles had provided demonstrated recognition that Anglo-Saxon survival served broader Christian interests that transcended narrow territorial boundaries. The tactical innovations that Æthelred had developed during his military campaigns established precedents that would prove crucial for Alfred's subsequent successes against Viking forces, as the combat techniques that emerged from years of intensive warfare incorporated lessons learned through direct observation of Scandinavian operational methods while exploiting geographical and cultural advantages that Anglo-Saxon forces possessed. The cavalry tactics that had proven effective during engagements such as Englefield demonstrated the potential for mobile warfare techniques that could match Viking tactical flexibility while exploiting the superior knowledge of local terrain that West Saxon commanders possessed. The siege warfare capabilities that Æthelred's forces had developed during their East Anglian operations provided technical expertise that would prove essential for the systematic reduction of Viking fortifications during subsequent campaigns, while the intelligence-gathering techniques that had been refined during his reign created information advantages that enabled more effective strategic planning. The administrative precedents that Æthelred had established for coordinating multi-kingdom military operations created frameworks that would prove essential for the broader coalitions that Alfred would eventually organise against Viking territorial expansion as the procedures developed for joint command structures, shared logistical arrangements, and coordinated strategic planning addressed fundamental challenges that had previously prevented effective cooperation between independent Anglo-Saxon rulers. The communication protocols that had been established during Æthelred's alliance with Mercia provided models for the more extensive coordination networks that would eventually encompass all remaining independent Anglo-Saxon territories, while the resource-sharing agreements that had been negotiated during the crisis years established precedents for the fiscal cooperation that sustained extended military campaigns. The population policies that Æthelred had implemented for managing refugee populations and integrating displaced communities established important precedents for the demographic challenges that would accompany the eventual reconquest of Viking-controlled territories, as the administrative procedures developed for providing assistance to displaced persons while maintaining social stability created frameworks that could be adapted for governing populations that had experienced prolonged Scandinavian rule. The cultural integration programs that had been developed for incorporating Northumbrian and East Anglian refugees into West Saxon society provided models for the broader assimilation challenges that would emerge as Anglo-Saxon political authority expanded into previously conquered territories, while the economic policies that had been implemented for utilising refugee skills and resources demonstrated methods for converting demographic challenges into strategic advantages. The technological innovations that Æthelred had promoted during his reign included both military developments that enhanced Anglo-Saxon combat capabilities and civilian improvements that strengthened the economic foundations necessary for sustained resistance efforts. The weapon manufacturing techniques that had been developed during the crisis years incorporated continental European innovations while adapting them to the specific combat requirements that Viking tactical methods created, producing equipment that could match Scandinavian weapon quality while exploiting the superior metallurgical resources that Anglo-Saxon territories possessed. The agricultural improvements that had been implemented to increase food production during periods of military disruption established precedents for the systematic land management policies that would prove essential for supporting expanded populations during subsequent territorial recovery efforts. The educational reforms that Æthelred had initiated established foundations for the comprehensive intellectual renaissance that would characterise Alfred's reign, as the recognition that effective governance during crisis periods required expanded administrative capabilities led to systematic efforts to increase literacy rates and improve educational quality throughout West Saxon territories. The curriculum innovations that emerged during this period balanced traditional Anglo-Saxon learning with practical skills necessary for governmental service, while the institutional arrangements that supported educational activities created networks of trained personnel that could staff the expanded administrative apparatus that crisis governance required. The scholarly exchange programs that connected West Saxon educational institutions with continental European centres of learning provided access to advanced knowledge while establishing cultural relationships that would prove valuable for diplomatic and military cooperation. The The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's treatment of Æthelred's reign reveals the complex editorial perspectives that shaped 9th century historical recording, as the various manuscript traditions preserved different emphases and interpretations that reflected the political priorities of their respective scriptoria during the immediate aftermath of his death. The Parker Chronicle, compiled at Winchester during Alfred's reign, presents Æthelred's military activities with particular attention to his tactical innovations and strategic planning, emphasising his role in developing the defensive capabilities that would prove crucial for subsequent Anglo-Saxon victories. The entries describing his battles demonstrate detailed knowledge of military operations that suggests access to eyewitness accounts or official military records, with specific references to troop movements, tactical formations, and casualty figures that provide unusually comprehensive coverage compared to earlier chronicle entries dealing with military campaigns. However, the chronicle's treatment also reveals significant biases that reflected the political necessities of Alfred's early reign, as the compilers emphasise continuity between the brothers' policies, while minimising references to strategic disagreements or tactical failures that might have undermined confidence in royal military leadership during ongoing Viking threats. The chronicle's description of Æthelred's death carefully avoids specific details regarding his final illness, presenting his passing as the natural conclusion of heroic service, rather than acknowledging the physical and psychological toll that years of crisis leadership had exacted. This editorial approach served important political functions during Alfred's consolidation of power, but it has created interpretive challenges for modern historians attempting to assess Æthelred's actual effectiveness as a military commander and political leader. The Frankish annals that mention Æthelred's activities provide valuable external perspectives that complement and sometimes contradict the Anglo-Saxon sources, revealing the broader European context that influenced contemporary assessments of his reign. The Annals of Saint-Bertin, compiled at the court of Charles the Bald, describe West Saxon resistance efforts as part of a coordinated Christian response to pagan expansion throughout northwestern Europe, emphasising Æthelred's role in maintaining defensive capabilities that prevented Viking forces from concentrating their full strength against Frankish territories. These accounts reveal that continental observers viewed Anglo-Saxon military effectiveness as a crucial factor in their own strategic calculations, suggesting that Æthelred's achievements had significance that extended far beyond the immediate territorial boundaries of his kingdom. The ecclesiastical sources that recorded Æthelred's reign provide additional perspectives that emphasise his support for Christian institutions and his role in preserving religious traditions during periods of intense military pressure. The Worcester Chronicle, compiled at the Cathedral Scriptorium that maintained extensive correspondence with continental religious centres, presents detailed accounts of royal grants to religious foundations and describes Æthelred's personal participation in ecclesiastical ceremonies despite the demands of military campaigning. These sources reveal the king's sophisticated understanding of the church's potential contributions to effective governance during crisis periods, while also documenting the practical challenges that warfare created for maintaining traditional religious observances and educational activities. Medieval chroniclers writing during the 12th and 13th centuries developed increasingly elaborate interpretations of Æthelred's reign that reflected the political and cultural priorities of their own periods rather than accurate historical analysis of 9th century events. The chroniclers associated with Glastonbury Abbey, seeking to enhance their institution's historical prestige, created detailed accounts of Æthelred's supposed patronage of their monastery that incorporated elements from multiple historical periods, while attributing to him religious policies that actually originated during later reigns. These medieval elaborations demonstrate the extent to which Æthelred's historical reputation became entangled with broader narratives about Anglo-Saxon resistance to foreign conquest that served contemporary political purposes rather than preserving accurate historical memory. The comparison between Æthelred and Alfred that dominated medieval and early modern historical writing consistently emphasised Alfred's ultimate success in achieving decisive victory over Viking forces while portraying Æthelred's reign as a necessary but ultimately unsuccessful prelude to his brother's achievements. This interpretive framework, which reflected the natural tendency to judge historical figures by their final outcomes rather than their responses to immediate challenges, obscured the extent to which Æthelred's institutional innovations and strategic planning had created the foundations that enabled Alfred's subsequent successes. The medieval chroniclers' focus on dramatic military victories and territorial conquests led them to undervalue the administrative reforms, alliance-building efforts, and defensive preparations that represented Æthelred's most significant contributions to Anglo-Saxon survival during the Viking crisis. Early modern historians, influenced by Renaissance humanist approaches to historical analysis, began developing more sophisticated assessments of Æthelred's reign that recognised the complexity of the challenges he'd confronted, while acknowledging the limitations that external circumstances had imposed on his policy options. The antiquarian scholars of the 16th and 17th centuries, working with expanded access to manuscript sources and influenced by contemporary military experiences, developed appreciation for the tactical innovations that Æthelred had implemented and the strategic sophistication that his defensive planning had demonstrated. Their analyses revealed the extent to which his reign had represented a crucial transition period during which traditional Anglo-Saxon military and administrative practices had been systematically adapted to address unprecedented challenges created by Viking territorial conquest. Modern archaeological evidence has provided crucial new perspectives on Æthelred's reign that complement and sometimes challenge the interpretations derived from literary sources, revealing material culture patterns that illuminate aspects of 9th century life that contemporary chroniclers either ignored or inadequately described. The excavations conducted at Reading during the 1960s and 1970s uncovered extensive evidence of the Viking fortifications that had been constructed during the 870-871 campaign, including defensive earthworks, weapon caches, and domestic artifacts that provide detailed insights into Scandinavian military organisation and daily life during their territorial conquest operations. The sophisticated engineering techniques revealed by these excavations demonstrate the advanced military capabilities that Æthelred's forces had confronted, while the evidence of rapid construction and systematic planning confirms contemporary accounts of Viking strategic sophistication. The battlefield archaeology conducted at potential sites for Æthelred's major engagements has provided mixed results that reflect both the methodological challenges involved in locating 9th century battle sites and the extent to which subsequent agricultural and urban development has disturbed archaeological deposits. The investigations at Englefield during the 1980s identified metalwork assemblages that include weapons and equipment consistent with 9th century military activities, though the dating evidence remains insufficiently precise to confirm direct association with the 870 battle. The discovery of mass burial sites in the Thames Valley region has provided evidence of the casualty levels that characterised Viking Age warfare, while the analysis of weapon fragments and personal ornaments has revealed details regarding military equipment and social status that complement information derived from contemporary written sources. The numismatic evidence from Æthelred's reign provides valuable insights into the economic pressures that Viking expansion created for Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, while revealing the administrative sophistication that characterised West Saxon governmental responses to these challenges. The silver pennies minted during his reign demonstrate consistent weight standards and artistic quality that indicate effective control over monetary systems despite the disruptions that warfare created for commercial activities. The distribution patterns of these coins revealed through systematic analysis of hoard deposits and individual finds, provide evidence of trade networks that remained active throughout the crisis period, while suggesting the geographical extent of West Saxon political authority during different phases of the Viking conflict. The comparative analysis of Æthelred's coinage with contemporary issues from other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms reveals the relative stability that West Saxon administrative systems maintained compared to the monetary chaos that characterized territories under direct Viking control. The material culture studies that have examined artifacts from 9th century contexts throughout former West Saxon territories have provided evidence of the cultural continuity that Æthelred's policies helped maintain during periods of intense military pressure. The pottery assemblages from domestic sites reveal continued production of traditional Anglo-Saxon ceramic forms alongside occasional Scandinavian-influenced pieces that suggest limited cultural exchange rather than systematic replacement of native traditions by foreign practices. The metalwork discoveries from both secular and religious contexts demonstrate the survival of Anglo-Saxon artistic traditions and craft techniques despite the economic disruptions that warfare created, while the evidence of continued construction activities at religious sites confirms the effectiveness of royal policies designed to protect ecclesiastical institutions during the crisis period. Contemporary scholarly debates regarding Æthelred's military effectiveness have been influenced by broader discussions within medieval studies regarding the nature of 9th century warfare and the criteria that should be employed for assessing military leadership during periods of existential crisis. The traditional emphasis on battlefield victories and territorial gains, which had dominated earlier historical assessments, has been supplemented by more sophisticated analyses that consider the strategic context within which individual commanders operated and the institutional innovations that enabled long-term resistance efforts. The recognition that Æthelred confronted unprecedented challenges that had no precedent in previous Anglo-Saxon military experience has led to more nuanced evaluations of his tactical decisions and strategic planning, while the detailed analysis of Viking military capabilities has provided better understanding of the obstacles that any Anglo-Saxon commander would have faced during this period. The reassessment of Æthelred's alliance-building efforts has revealed the sophisticated diplomatic skills that he demonstrated in creating cooperative relationships between traditionally competitive kingdoms while maintaining West Saxon sovereignty and strategic independence. The analysis of contemporary diplomatic correspondence and treaty arrangements has shown that his negotiations with Mercian leaders required careful balancing of immediate military necessities against long-term political considerations, creating frameworks for cooperation that would prove essential for subsequent Anglo-Saxon victories, while avoiding commitments that might have compromised West Saxon autonomy. The marriage alliance that connected Alfred with Mercian nobility represents a diplomatic achievement that modern scholars have recognised as crucial for the eventual unification of Anglo-Saxon territories under unified royal authority. The evaluation of Æthelred's administrative innovations has benefited from comparative studies that examine similar governmental responses to military crises in contemporary European contexts, revealing the extent to which his reforms incorporated advanced techniques while adapting them to the specific cultural and political conditions that characterized Anglo-Saxon society. The fiscal policies that he implemented for generating additional royal revenues demonstrate sophisticated understanding of economic principles and practical constraints that enabled effective resource mobilization without creating social disruptions that might have undermined popular support for continued resistance. The administrative procedures that he developed for coordinating military operations across multiple kingdoms established precedents that would prove essential for the larger coalitions that Alfred would eventually organize against Viking territorial expansion. Modern historians have increasingly recognized that Æthelred's contribution to the eventual survival of Anglo-Saxon England extended far beyond his immediate military activities to encompass institutional innovations and cultural preservation efforts that created foundations for the intellectual and political renaissance that characterised Alfred's subsequent reign. The educational policies that he supported during the crisis years maintained the scholarly traditions and administrative capabilities that enabled the comprehensive governmental reforms that distinguished Alfred's rule, while the legal precedents that he established during emergency conditions provided frameworks for the systematic law codes that would become central elements of later Anglo-Saxon political development. The fortification programs that he initiated established defensive networks that would prove crucial for Alfred's military successes, while the intelligence-gathering capabilities that he developed created information advantages that enabled more effective strategic planning during subsequent phases of the Viking conflict. The broader significance of Æthelred's reign within the context of early medieval European political development has become increasingly apparent as scholars have recognised the extent to which Anglo-Saxon resistance to Viking expansion influenced political arrangements throughout northwestern Europe during the 9th and 10th centuries. The survival of independent Anglo-Saxon kingdoms prevented the establishment of a unified Scandinavian empire that might have fundamentally altered the balance of power between Germanic and Romance populations. Throughout the region, while the military innovations that emerged from Anglo-Saxon defensive efforts influenced tactical development and fortification techniques that would prove significant during subsequent medieval conflicts. The administrative precedents that Æthelred established for coordinating multi-kingdom operations provided models for the larger political confederations that would eventually emerge throughout medieval Europe as responses to external threats and internal challenges. The historiographical rehabilitation of Æthelred's reputation represents part of a broader scholarly trend toward recognizing the complexity of early medieval political leadership and the extent to which traditional narratives focused on individual achievements have obscured the institutional and cultural factors that enabled long-term historical developments. The recognition that his reign occurred during a crucial transition period, when traditional Anglo-Saxon political and military structures were being systematically adapted to address unprecedented challenges, has led to greater appreciation for the innovative responses that he developed, while acknowledging the limitations that external circumstances imposed on his policy options. The understanding that his death occurred at a moment when the ultimate outcome of Anglo-Saxon resistance remained uncertain has encouraged more balanced assessments that evaluate his achievements within their proper historical context, rather than judging them solely by their relationship to subsequent developments. Æthelred's reign, lasting from 865 to 871, represents one of the most crucial periods in early English history, a time when the survival of Anglo-Saxon civilization hung in the balance against the systematic territorial conquest undertaken by the great heathen army. His 6 years as King of Wessex coincided with the most intensive phase of Viking expansion in England, during which the traditional political structures that had governed Anglo-Saxon territories for centuries were systematically dismantled through military conquest and administrative replacement. The institutional innovations, strategic planning, and cultural preservation efforts that characterized his response to this existential crisis established foundations that would prove essential for the eventual survival and expansion of Anglo-Saxon political authority throughout England. While his reign ended in apparent failure, with Viking forces controlling vast territories and threatening the final conquest of Wessex itself, the governmental structures, military capabilities and diplomatic relationships that he had developed during the crisis years provided his successor Alfred with the tools necessary for achieving the decisive victories that would secure Anglo-Saxon independence and establish the foundations for the eventual unification of England under unified royal authority. Modern scholarship has increasingly recognised that Æthelred's contributions to this ultimate success were as significant as Alfred's more celebrated achievements, representing the essential preparatory work that enabled subsequent triumphs while demonstrating the sophisticated leadership capabilities that sustained Anglo-Saxon resistance during its darkest period.